Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like, and let me know what you think in the comments. They say folk stories are how we transmit transcendent truths across generations. The quintessential American folk story is the campfire tale. The pedagogical value of this tradition is opaque. We usually think of them only as scary stories for kids. After having a peculiar experience, I believe there is more to be gleaned if you look. There's a certain backcountry area about an hour and a half from my hometown where campgrounds seem to grow like weeds. Besides park and conservation area campsites, there are at least a couple dozen full camping complexes operated by various churches, schools, and organizations, all within about 40,000 acres. This area has a campfire ghost story that seems to be particular to it. I stayed at 3 different overnight activity camps around there as a kid, 1 Cub Scouts camp, 1 Junior Achievement camp, and a for-profit summer camp. At all 3, I heard some version of the story told around a bonfire. I also overheard it being told at a neighboring fire pit when my family stayed at a park resort around there. I never heard it at any of the other various scouting camps I went to, and I've found no evidence that the legend exists outside that little camping micro-community. The essentials are that a young girl at one of the local camps was playing recklessly around a bonfire and fell in face first. She has presumably died and now walks the fields and back roads at night, her horribly burnt face visible to anyone who crosses her path. That's pretty much it. The standard telling doesn't mention her actually doing anything to people besides scaring them. Yet this story managed to freak me out as a kid more than any other campfire tale. Burning was one of my biggest childhood fears. Not just burning of my own body, but the idea of witnessing someone else burn. To have your face burn off seemed worse than death itself. Would life even be worth living after something like that? It didn't help that this story, at least the part about the girl falling into the fire, felt like a true one. My mom once mentioned that she heard about something like that at a Girl Scout camp in the area when she was young. My enthusiasm for communal camping continued into my teens. I heard the story as an assistant camp counselor a couple times. Then in college, I started volunteering with a camp for troubled preteen boys. At a fall weekend retreat with this organization, I decided the story of the girl who fell into a campfire and burned her face would be a good way to discourage horseplay. There were about a dozen youths at this retreat, and almost as many counselors and chaperones. We gathered around a fire pit surrounded by woodland and had some group bonding time. When it came time to tell scary stories, I went last. I relayed the story of Sarah Silverstein, the name I had decided to give the poor girl, with verve being sure to pantomime key moments. My telling of the story had all the dramatic bits I had heard over the years. The girl's stubborn refusal to listen to camp counselors, her tragic death as a result of the burning, and her lich like haunting of the woods and roads with her sooty, disfigured face. The wind picked up during my performance, adding to the ambience. When I finished, the boys just stared in stunned silence. I think I killed the mood for the rest of the night. After an uncomfortable silence, one of the other counselors made a joke, and the tension broke somewhat. Still, the kids had a subdued demeanor as we wrapped up and returned to the facilities for the night. That night I had a terrible nightmare. It was my first dream about the campfire girl in years. Some of it involved encountering her on the road or in the woods, but most of it was just me being forced to watch her falling into the fire over and over. In the morning, we set off in the camp minibus for a museum trip. It was raining. Despite my nightmare, I was relaxed. Then the bus had radiator trouble, and we had to stop on a gravel-back road barely 3 miles from camp. We called a tow truck, but it was expected to take at least an hour and a half to arrive. By now the weather was really getting bad. The road was lightly wooded on either side, and I started to worry that a tree would fall on the minibus. According to Google Maps, there was a camp just under a mile away. It was a church camp, and the app didn't say it was closed. I tried calling the listed number, but my reception dropped at that moment. Fearing the weather would deteriorate further, I volunteered to make a dash for it and see if there was anyone who could help us, while another adult made the 3-mile journey back to our camp to get his personal vehicle. The journey took me down the gravel road for a ways, then a paved 2-lane road, then another gravel road. I had to cut across a field to avoid creek flooding. The storm started to break as I came in view of the gate to the church camp. Finding the gate unlocked, I pushed past it and walked toward what looked like the administrative building. I noted that they had their own bus parked outside. After I rang the doorbell a couple times, an elderly woman answered. "Oh dear, you're soaked," was the first thing she said. I chuckled slightly, then explained the situation. "Oh yes, come in." "Come in," she hastened. I hung up my rain suit on a coat rack just inside the door at her direction. She briefly said something about preparing for an incoming group of campers the next weekend, before asking me to go over my story again. She asked if I would like her husband to take us back to our camp in their bus. I was about to say yes, but then remembered that the main road was flooded. She said there was another way around that didn't have any streams. When I accepted her offer, she sat down at the desk and picked up a walkie-talkie. "Hey, John," she spoke into it. "There's a man here from the reform camp. He says their bus broke down and they need help. Can you come to the office?" I heard the man say he was on his way. She explained that he was on the other side of the camp and would be a minute, then asked if I would like some coffee. The woman's face was discolored in several places. There was scar tissue around her cheeks and nose, and darkened skin covering much of her neck. There were some spots that looked like they were once blisters. Still, she had gentle eyes and a warm smile. I smiled back as I accepted her offer. "Yes, that would be great. Thank you very much." Well, girls, which car should we take on our little road trip? Dad's Chevy Nomad would be practical, but the Chevy Nova's got a bit more flair to her. Of course, if it's flair we're going for, I don't think anything we have can compete with a classic Cadillac. James Darling said as he surveyed his automotive fleet with a sense of satisfied pride. The Darlings had acquired many vehicles over their long and nefarious career, more often than not stolen from their victims, and repurposed in future instruments of entrapment and torment. James had kept their favorites running flawlessly over the years, modifying them as necessary with his own mechatronic inventions, when conventional parts simply wouldn't do. That's a bit of a leading question, isn't it, James Darling? "You know, the Corvette is my favorite," Mary Darling replied. "It's the quintessential American sports car. Nothing else we have drives like it. That was the first car you actually bought, and you bought it for me. I still remember the first victim I ran down with it." "Huh, but you only like getting blood on the outside of the Corvette." James countered as he shoved their bound and gagged victim onto the concrete floor. She was too exhausted to offer any resistance, and her hollow eyes just stared off into the distance, her mind barely registering what was happening anymore. "You're extremely meticulous about keeping the inside immaculate. Remember Mary Darling." "True enough, James Darling, but it's not as if I don't have experience in keeping blood from corpses and victims from seeping into the upholstery," Mary argued, prodding the girl with her foot to test whether she was the latter or the former. "Plus, a sports car is a flasher status symbol than a caddy. Suppose we ran into Veronica and that silly little purple Porsche she has. Wouldn't it make sense to be in something that can both outshine and outrun her?" "But Mommy Darling, this is a family road trip, and the Corvette is not a family car," Sarah Darling sang sweetly as she stepped over their victim, like she was a piece of luggage, excitedly casting her black eyes over the selection of vehicles on offer. Besides, something about a sports car just screams new money. "No, we need something with more seating and a softer spoken elegance. The Bel Air and the Oldsmobile 88 are perfectly charming, and I do like them both, but Daddy Darling's right. This is a special occasion, and only our very best vehicle will do. I think we should take the Cadillac, if for no other reason than it's Daddy Darling's favorite. He is the only one of us who can legally drive, after all." "Looks like you're outvoted, Mary Darling." James smiled while consolingly putting his arm around Mary's waist and leading her over to the winning vehicle. Modern Cadillacs may not stand out much in today's overcrowded luxury market, but a classic like this remains the pinnacle of luxury and refinement. Not to mention the presidential state car is still a Cadillac. That's got to count for something. The Corvette is still the more iconic car, but I'll admit the Cadillac is more practical for our outing today, Mary conceded. But if anyone asks, my car is a Vetted. Sarah darling, I'm riding up front with your father. Of course. Mommy darling, children and vapes should always ride in the back seat. Sarah agreed as she held up her head in smug self-importance. Guest will have to go into the trunk, though. She's liable to attract unwanted attention in this condition, James said as he slung her over his shoulder and carried her around to the back of the Cadillac. That's fine, Daddy darling. I like to keep a seat free in case we pick up a hitchhiker. Sarah chimed in. I wouldn't get your hopes up, Sarah darling. Hitchhikers aren't as common as they used to be. Mary cautioned her. Afraid of serial killers, I'd imagine, which is ironic, since there aren't as many of us around anymore either. Damn, modern forensics make it nearly impossible for an amateur to get started these days. James lamented as he tossed the girl into the trunk, followed by a few suitcases which he arranged to keep her concealed. A single mass shooting is the best any of them can usually manage. The plebs living in fear of mass shootings is better than nothing, I suppose, but serial killings inspire a more insidious flavor of paranoia. You know who the mass shooter is the second he fires off his gaudy assault rifle, but any of your neighbors could be a serial killer and you'd never know it. After closing and locking the trunk, James opened the back passenger side door for his daughter and the front passenger side door for his sister before popping into the driver's seat himself. It's been a while since we've made a pilgrimage to the Shrine of Moros, he remarked as he turned the ignition key. I can't wait to show the bile how much you've grown, Sarah darling. The eternally preteen girl smiled at him in the rearview mirror. Now don't you get lulled into my sweet little girl routine, Daddy darling. I've grown plenty in ways that you can't see, she boasted, her fluid black irises flaring slightly as her power coursed through her physical body. James turned the dial on the control to his garage door opener, flipping through the preset destinations until he found a location relatively close to the shrine. He had never put a portal anywhere remotely close to it, let alone one by the shrine itself, out of fear of drawing unwanted attention to it. This one appears to be in good working order. We should be able to make reasonable enough time leaving from here, he said as the door clanked open, revealing a rainy November day on the outside of their playroom. Why can't the outside world ever be nice for once? We're on a family trip. Mary complained as she drew out her flask and took a swig. It's just a little rain, Mary darling. We've been through far worse. James consoled her as he preemptively turned the wipers on. I like the rain. It's a necessity of life that people often fail to appreciate, and one that will occasionally escalate into a natural disaster. Sarah commented. Isn't it wonderful how even the most essential pillars of life can turn against it, wreaking death and devastation for no reason at all? It truly is, Sarah darling. It truly is. Her father agreed as he slowly turned the Cadillac towards the open door, once more into the breach. Sensator to Mary's chagrin and Sarah's delight, the rain did not let up. Sarah was legitimately more thoughtful than her mother, and found a stark and somber beauty in the world under a gray November sky. The leaves were gone, the flowers were gone, and the snow had yet to come, but such a seemingly bleak vista was not without its charm. The world felt silent, still liminal, not a deprivation but a respite from its seasonal happenings. Everything beautiful about winter. Spring, summer, and fall would come again, and their absence was not always a bad thing. Nothing good could last forever, because too much of anything ceased to be good. Fleeting things must be appreciated while they last, and so too must the fleeting rest between them. Sarah refrained from speaking these thoughts aloud, as they weren't sufficiently morbid. As they drove down increasingly lonely highways, the sky grew darker and the rainfall more intense. Massive puddles formed within eroded potholes, sending up great splashes of dirty water as they drove through them. Weren't you glad we didn't take the Corvette now, Mary darling? Roads like these are no place for a low-riding sports car, James remarked. Hell, I'm beginning to regret not taking Uncle Larry's surplus Army Jeep. Then again, with the size of these puddles, the amphicar might have been more appropriate. The condition of this highway is an absolute indictment on the public road system. Mary insisted. A classic tragedy of the commons. I would never let the roads in our playroom get any near this bad unless it was for a hunt. Are these parasites really so adverse to privatized services that they prefer this to the occasional toll booth? I think the bumpy roads are kind of fun, mommy darling, Sarah said, bouncing slightly as they drove over another pothole. Plus bad weather and bad roads make it more likely we'll see an accident. I don't want to get your hopes up, Sarah darling, but I think I see somebody walking along the shoulder up ahead of us, James said as he squinted ahead. Really? Sarah squealed as she shot forward. Dead ahead of them was a man in a dark green raincoat with a matching duffel bag slung across his back, stalwartly trudging through the onslaught of pelting rain. In this weather, he must be a drifter, Mary said. Easy prey. He's not hitchhiking though, so he's a stubborn bastard at least. That could make him fun prey. Shan't we pick anyway, Daddy darling? Oh please, oh please, oh please, Sarah pleaded. We can offer him a ride, Sarah darling, but if he doesn't take it, I'm afraid we can't go chasing after him, James replied. We don't want to be late to the shrine now, do we? As they drove past the man, James pulled over to the side of the road in front of him. Sarah immediately sprung into action, popping her door open and sticking her head out into the pouring rain. He there, mister. Want a ride? She asked, loudly enough to be heard over the weather, but still managing to come across as sweet and cheerful. The man hesitated for only an instant before breaking into a jog and hopping into the Cadillac as quickly as he could. Thank you so much. If you could just take me as far as the next truck stop. I won't trouble you any more than that, he said as he pulled down his hood and shook the rain out of his hair. Oh, it's no trouble, James assured him as he pulled back onto the highway. You trying to make your way to Toronto, or thereabouts? Thereabouts, yeah. Only place in this province that's not a rural backwater, right? The man replied as he reflexively reached for a seatbelt, only to realize that there weren't any. It's practically New York with poutine, James laughed. I'm sure you can find poutine in New York, James darling, Mary said. Not that we'd ever go looking for it, of course. Our family prefers homemade food due to our unique culinary traditions. You weren't really trying to walk all the way to Toronto, were you, ducky? If I had to. I figured that I could hoof it there in a few days, but I guess the weather had other plans, the man said as he looked around the cabin in confusion. Hey, are there seat belts in this thing? Man, of course not. This is a 57 Cadillac, son. It was made in Detroit during the city's golden years. You can't tarnish a gem like this with modern safety fetishes, James replied. Is that even legal, man? Especially with a kid, the man asked. School buses don't have seat belts, and they're normally full of nothing but children, so they can't really be that important, now can they? Mary argued. And even if they are, we don't really believe in seat belts. Sarah added, people today are too risk-averse. Great men should confront danger, and weak men should be culled by it. Keeping the weak alive and the great restrained makes all of us worse off in the long run. Hey, are you too sure you're comfortable with me sitting back here with your sister? The man asked, nervously appraising her strange eyes. Because I'd totally understand if you don't. Oh, don't you worry. Sarah darling doesn't bite. That's what Mary darling's here for, James assured him. I'm James. By the way, what's your name, traveler? Call me Garland, the man replied. So then, Garland, mind if I ask what circumstances possessed you to head to Toronto on foot? James asked. It can't be that hard to scrounge up the money for bus fare, can it? It was a kind of a spur of the moment sort of thing, you know. I just needed to be on my way, so I decided to pack a bag, pick a direction, and see how far I got, Garland explained. Adventurous. I like that. James nodded approvingly, hoping that a change of scenery would bring a change of fortunes as well. I take it? Something like that, yeah, Garland replied, gazing out the rain-streaked windows at the tall rows of pines swaying in the howling wind. What do you think it's like to be a tree standing tall and proud for centuries, only to be snapped in half by a wayward gust of wind in a bad storm? Sarah asked. To be so seemingly invulnerable for so long, only to be struck down by the chance movements of forces far outside your control and comprehension. Oh, I don't think trees think about that kind of thing, and a girl your age probably shouldn't be either, Garland replied. Oh, our little Sarah Darling has always had a keen interest in philosophy, Mary boasted. For instance, Sarah Darling, what do you make of our guest here accepting our invitation? He was free when he was outside, but freedom was terrible, so he forfeited it for a modicum of comfort, scarcely even weighing the risk of putting himself at our mercy, Sarah replied dutifully. And of course, one of the fundamental tenets of Western philosophy is that he who sacrifices freedom for safety deserves neither, hence the lack of seatbelts. You're homeschooled, aren't you, kid? Garland asked. It's obvious, isn't it? The public schools are as bad as the roads, and never produce children anywhere near as erudite as our little Sarah. Mary beamed as she took out a cigarette and lit it with her Zippo lighter, quickly filling the sealed car with smoke. And even the best of private schools wouldn't have been able to give our progeny the specialized education that she requires. I shudder to think what would have happened to James and I if our Uncle Larry hadn't stepped in to fill the academic gaps in our upbringing. Oh, I'm sorry. Where are my manners? Can I offer you a smoke, Ducky? I'm good, thanks, he said awkwardly. You know, I may not be sure about the seatbelts, but it's definitely illegal to smoke with kids in the car. That's absurd. Do you expect me to put my sweet little girl outside in this weather? Mary balked. How is pouring rain better than a few puffs of smoke? Honestly, people just don't think things through these days. Daddy darling, even though I know the answer, my daughterly duties oblige me to ask at least once, or are we there yet? Sarah asked. Our turn-off is just up here, Sarah darling, James replied as he hit his turn signal. Garland didn't see a road up ahead, just a gap between two trees barely wide enough for a car to pass through. The one on the left had an old, rusty sign nailed to it that read private property, no trespassing, and the one on the right had a sign that said dead, end, keep out. All these years, and no one's taken down those signs, James remarked as he veered to the left. This road really has seen better days, as they passed between the trees. Garland was struck with an inexplicable shudder that took him so off guard that he didn't immediately notice that the rain had come to a sudden stop. Despite this, the sky became darker and the tall skeletal trees little more than silhouettes in the gloom. Though he was quite certain there had been no road at all before, an overgrown dirt path meandered through the forest before them. Where are we? He asked as he leaned forward, trying to see as much as he could. Didn't you see the sign? It's private property, James answered, so private that only a privileged few can notice it or remember that it exists. Hallowed, I think, is the term. I'm not sure there are many people who would describe this place as hallowed, James darling, Mary said. Or Uncle Larry first brought James and I here when we were just kids, and it was quite the macabre spectacle back then. It's good to know that some things never change. But as Garland's eyes adjusted to the low light, he saw that the upper branches of the trees were all impaled with blackened human bodies. Though most had no doubt been there for many years, all were encircled by fresh swarms of buzzing and bloated flies. What the hell, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell? Garland stammered as he threw himself back against the seat, his eyes flicking back and forth between the obvious horrors outside the car and the insidious ones within. I agree. It sacks subtlety, James commented. Our own playroom wasn't much better when we first came across it. Thank goodness for Mary Darling's remarkable homemaking skills. She really turned it into a proper home for us. Oh, you're too kind, James Darling, Mary blushed. Unfortunately, my gifts are rather limited outside of our domestic sphere, so there's not much I can do about this place. Sarah Darling, on the other hand, should be quite attuned with the bile here. Any changes you'd like to make to the decor, sweetie? It is awfully quiet, isn't it? Sarah asked rhetorically, her fluid black irises pulsating as all the impaled bodies were simultaneously brought back to life. A cacophony of tortured screams tore through the woods, boughs creaking as the flailing revenants spazzed in terrified agony. That's better, Sarah sighed with a contented smile. Corpses aren't really scary. They can almost be serene like a rotting log. It's just part of nature. But living mutilated victims kept in protracted torture against the very laws of nature. That's sublime. Don't you agree, Mr. Garland? Garland desperately looked out the rear window to make sure the path out of the cursed woods was still visible, leaving his duffel bag behind. He threw open the door and jumped out of the car, breaking into a mad run as soon as his feet hit the ground. He didn't get very far before a tree branch in front of him broke, sending one of the screaming revenants crashing to the ground and blocking his path. He skidded to a stop, watching as it wildly thrashed about, trying to right itself. He heard other branches snapping and realized he would soon be outnumbered by the wretched abominations. He spun around to see if the darlings were pursuing him, only to see the Cadillac waiting patiently on the trail with its side door still open and Sarah's smiling head poking out of it. "Freedom or safety, mister? What's it gonna be?" she asked before retreating back inside. The screams around him grew more ferocious, more vengeful, and he could hear them now clumsily crashing through the underbrush towards him. He ran for the Cadillac as fast as he could, diving into the back seat and slamming the door behind him. "You chose wrong. Again," Sarah said flatly as she sat straight with her hands neatly folded in her lap. "But you're safe. I'd never let those plotting cretins vandalize my darling daddy's darling caddy." How the hell are you controlling those things?" "What the hell are you?" Garland demanded. Sarah smiled widely as her black eyes suddenly shifted in his direction. "It's like you said, Mr. Garland, I'm homeschooled," she replied in a sinisterly lilting voice. "It's amazing what a bright young mind can learn when her home is a microcosmic basement universe between dimensions, isn't it?" Garland's fear quickly morphed into frustration and anger, giving no credence to her words but instead trying to contrive some method of escape, or failing that, revenge. "Oh, you're thinking of taking me hostage, aren't you, Mr. Garland?" Sarah taunted. "So ungrateful. If it wasn't for me, you'd still be walking out there in the rain. All I did was offer you a choice, Mr. Garland, and you made one. You have no one to blame for this but yourself. You know, son, impotent or not, I don't much care for it when someone threatens either of my two favorite girls," James said coldly, glancing up at him in the rearview mirror. "I'm sure you can understand." "I didn't say anything," Garland muttered, placing his hands in his pocket and withdrawing as far away from Sarah as he could. "You were thinking about putting me in a chokehold and demanding that Daddy Darling turn the car around." Sarah insisted. "You thought you could break my neck fast enough to keep my parents from attacking you while I was in your grasp. You wanted to see me crying, to wipe this smug grin off my face. Is that all it takes to make you want to hurt a little girl, Mr. Garland? I think I'd like to see you crying, Mr. Garland, and my happiness is much more important than yours. Daddy Darling, floor it." At her insistence, her father slammed on the gas, and the Cadillac went speeding down the forested dirt road with so much force that Garland was pinned against his seat. Above the roar of the engine, he could hear the ravenous howling of the revenants as they crashed through the forest, pursuing the vehicle without any sense of self-preservation. "What the hell is going on now?" Garland demanded as he craned his neck to see the horde galloping after them on all fours like wild animals. "I infused them with our addiction for human flesh, and nothing else, so now all they can feel is an all-consuming hunger that can't be ignored until it's sated," Sarah explained, never dropping her cheery tone or smiling face. "And that's how they behave. And to think, James Darling, you once said that I can't resist temptation," Mary commented. "I'm not reduced to such savagery at the mere prospect of fresh meat. The hunt has to be well underway before I descend into such heavenly primal madness." "Well, in their defense, Mary Darling, they are quite starved, whereas you made us all steak and eggs for breakfast this morning," James said as he deftly wove around the trees, a skill that not all the revenants had mastered quite as well. "They're gonna eat us, you crazy kid. You're all fucking crazy," Garland screamed. "Calm down. They're completely under Sarah's control, and she was telling the truth about not wanting to hurt the caddy. She's too much of a daddy's girl for such senseless vandalism," Mary claimed. "But Mommy Darling, suppose that Daddy Darling made such a sharp turn that Miss Sarah..." Garland was thrown against the door with so much force he knocked it open and went flying out of the vehicle. Sarah suggested. Then the revenants could eat him without ever laying a finger on Daddy's Cadillac. Seemingly by Sarah's command, and perhaps her mere desire, a sharp bend appeared in the road ahead of them, and James didn't slow down in the slightest as he veered around it. As Sarah had predicted, or ordained, the force was enough to slam Garland against the door on his side, knocking it open and sending him tumbling to the forest floor. The revenants were on him within seconds, and Garland punched and kicked wildly without even aiming for any specific target. Each of his limbs was almost immediately immobilized by many firm revenant hands, and he braced himself for the agony of their fingers ripping him apart and their teeth digging into him with wild abandon. But that didn't happen. They were at the whim of their young mistress, and it seemed her whim had changed yet again. Instead, the horde began to chase after the Cadillac, holding Garland overhead and making sure he had no chance to escape. They didn't stop or even slow down until they reached an ancient glade nestled deep in the heart of the dying woods. In the center of the glade was a large well of crumbling black stones, measuring 13 feet across with a staircase of 7 uneven steps leading up to the rim. The Darlings had already parked and gotten out of their car, and Garland watched in horror as James took their earlier victim out of their trunk. "Don't feel bad, Mr. Garland. You couldn't have helped her," Sarah assured him. "How could you? You couldn't even help yourself." The revenants tossed Garland to the ground at Sarah's feet before instantly scattering back into the surrounding woods. He looked up in horror at the placid and serene face of the young girl, not daring to try to flee or fight back. "That's better," Sarah commented, flashing him a satisfied smile. "It was my idea to pick you up, Mr. Garland, which means I get to decide what we do with you. Feeding you to the revenants would have been a waste, but other than that, I'm still mulling over my options. Dead or alive, you'd probably be more risk than you're worth to take back to the playroom. But I'll give you the chance to change my mind about that. Stay right where you are and be quiet while my parents and I conduct our business here, and I'll see to you when we're finished." She turned away from him in disinterest, making no attempt to secure him, and took her place by her father's side. "How's our sacrifice, Daddy darling?" she asked. "When we didn't get so much of a thump out of her, I worried she might not have survived the journey, but it seems she's merely dead on the inside." James replied as he hefted the catatonic woman up and down. "No use to any of us as a plaything now, and not enough meat on her bones to fret about losing. She'll make a fine revenant for the bile." Sarah grabbed the woman's cheeks with her right hand and forced her to make eye contact with her, probing deep down into the darkest recesses of her mind. "We broke her so badly that only the bile can fix her now," Sarah pronounced. "Since her life is no longer of any value to either us or herself, it is only proper that we surrender her to the one entity who can extract any further utility from her." With purposeful strides, she ascended the short staircase to the edge of the well, with her parents following closely behind. The well was too deep and too dark to see the bottom of it, but that didn't matter. They knew what was down there, and it saw them easily enough. A chorus of hoarse whispers began echoing up its shaft, chanting in a dead tongue in anticipation of the sacrifice. Sarah gazed down deep into the darkness below, the black bile in her eyes expanding beyond her irises and consuming them entirely. Mora's the all-destroyer, god of doom, death, and suffering. Sign of primordial night and primeval dark, kin to Reaper's Valkyries and the Fates themselves. Greater are you than the Olympians, the Titans, and all others who would seek the mantle of omnipotence. Sarah pontificated. While hope lay trapped within Pandora's box, doom spread far to rot the world from within. While Moloch and his progeny gnaw at the roots of the world tree from below, and ravenous Yaldabaoth devours it from above, your incarnate bile seeps in from all sides through whatever cracks in the firmament there may be. We have come here today because we are once again in need of your largest, great Moros. Those who walk in the footsteps of the world serpent have forsaken us, pledging themselves to Emrys, avatar of the darkness beyond the veil. He seeks to destroy us, and even now shards of a miasmic blade still lie within my father's heart from a failed assault by his acolyte. Though Emrys seeks only the demise of our family, he has aligned himself with the god, slaying Zarathustrans, and they shall not be satisfied until they have fattened themselves upon your dark ichor, mighty Moros." A great unsatisfied rumbling reverberated from deep within the well, along with a pluming vortex of fall wind, and it was a relief to the Darlings that their patron deity recognized that it had a stake in their conflict. The wilting empress has been unleashed. The effulgent one walks where will between the plains, and witches again make covens with stonic deities. A battle of great titans and their followers is nigh at hand, Moros. And we have come to assure you that in this greatest of iconoclasms, we are yours to command. We offer you this sacrifice to reaffirm our covenant, and in exchange, we ask that you purge my father of his miasmic taint, so that he may fight for us and you with all his strength. May all come to rot and ruin, corroded beneath the black bile of Moros. Sarah bowed her head and took a step back, making way for her father to approach the edge of the well. With a solid heave, James tossed the nearly dead woman into the well. She plummeted through the dark for several seconds before landing into the bile with a sickening, squelching splat. The horror that overtook her as the black bile oozed into her body and began remaking her in its own image was finally enough to make her scream again. "Don't know what she's so upset about. She was pretty much a zombie already," James mocked. His body suddenly went taut, and he could feel the miasmic shards in his chest being nudged, luged loose with the utmost precision, the bile in his veins guiding them with only the lightest of touches in short bursts to minimize the damage to his surrounding tissue. When each individual shard was oriented correctly, they silently and swiftly shot out of his chest and into the spiraling vortex to be swept down into the well. Though James cried out in pain as he clutched his chest and dropped to his knees, it faded quickly as the exit wounds healed at a superhuman rate. "Daddy. James, darling, are you all right?" Mary asked as she and Sark knelt down to aid him. "Wes, yes, it's gone. It's completely gone." James laughed in relief. "Emrys won't have that hanging over our heads any longer." They hugged and cheered in triumph, none of them noticing that Garland had been slowly creeping up behind them while they'd been focused on their dark ritual. It seemed to him that they had forgotten about him entirely, and now he was only a few meters behind them. His plan had been to only push the girl into the well, but with all of them so close together, he decided to go for them all. As silently as he could, he pounced forwards with as much momentum as he could muster. His attack was met with a sharp wailing sound ascending up the well, and only an instant before he made contact with the Darlings. He was impaled through the forehead by a strange dagger. It hit him with so much force he went tumbling backwards, and he was dead before he hit the ground. The Darlings, though completely unperturbed by the attempt on their lives, gathered around the corpse to study the instrument of its demise. "Is that?" Mary trailed off, reticent to even say it out loud. Sarah tentatively grabbed the hilt of the dagger and slowly drew it out, revealing that its serpentine blade had been cobbled together by the miasmic fragments Moros had pulled from James' heart. The shards were held together by vitrified and gilded bile, the same substance as the hilt, now inert and incapable of reacting with either the miasma or the flesh of Sarah's hand. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her black eyes wide in wonder. "Here, Mommy darling, you should have it. You're the best with knives of all of us, and it came from Daddy Darling's heart, so it's rightfully yours anyway." "Why, thank you, Sarah darling," Mary said as she graciously accepted the gift, studying it intently. The longer she held it, the wider and more wicked her smile grew, until at last she could hold in her dark revelation no longer. "This is the knife that I'm going to kill Emrys with." It was a crisp Saturday morning when I stumbled upon a garage sale. It seemed ordinary enough for old clothes, dusty books, and forgotten toys strewn across a lawn. I was about to walk past it when a small, weathered box caught my eye, sitting apart from the rest of the items. Inside were VHS tapes, most unlabeled and coated with a thin layer of grime, except for one that read coloring with Steve in childlike handwriting. Curiosity piqued. I paid the old man at the sale, who offered no more than a faint smile and a nod, and took the tapes home. My old VCR creaked when I inserted the first tape, and the screen lit up with a slight flicker. The show began simply enough. A man with kind eyes and an easy smile sat at a table in front of a soft, pastel backdrop covered in crayons, colored pencils, and papers. "Hello, friends," Steve said in a voice that could soothe a storm. "Today, we're going to color something special, a cozy little house." There was an unexplainable warmth about him. He spoke to the camera as if he were directly addressing me. The scratching of crayons on paper was oddly satisfying, and the subtle colors filled the screen with a peaceful, hypnotic quality. But there was something else. The faint hum of static buzzed in the background, barely noticeable at first, but it crept into my awareness as the episode went on. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the age of the tape. The first episode concluded with Steve holding up his drawing of the house, framed with smiling clouds and a bright sun. His smile, however, felt too wide, like it lingered just a second too long before the screen cut to black. Then, there it was, a single frame of something else. Something wrong. I leaned forward, replaying the end of the tape frame by frame. For the briefest moment, there it was again, a dark room, barely lit by the dim glow of what looked like a lantern. The shapes were hard to make out, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. Shadows cast by twisted objects lined the walls, and something or someone stood in the corner, facing away. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized the figure seemed to be holding something, a crayon. Perhaps. I blinked and the screen turned black again, leaving me in the silence of my living room. I shivered and reached for the next tape. The second tape sat heavy in my hands, its plastic casing oddly cool against my fingers. I hesitated, the image from the end of the first tape still etched into my mind. Yet curiosity gnawed at me more fiercely than any sense of self-preservation. I pressed play, and the familiar hum of the VCR brought the screen to life. Steve appeared, sitting at his art table with that soft, reassuring smile. "Hello again, friends," he greeted, and this time his voice seemed to echo, as if the room behind him were much larger than the backdrop suggested. "Today, we'll venture into the forest." There was something different about him. Something in the way his eyes seemed to dart to the corners of the screen, as if checking for something just out of view. The pastel background remained the same, but the lighting appeared dimmer, almost as if a shadow loomed just outside the frame. Steve reached for a dark green crayon, fingers trembling ever so slightly, and began sketching a forest. The familiar scratching sound returned, but it was slower, more deliberate this time. I leaned forward, squinting. The scene unfolded. Trees with long, gnarled limbs crept across the paper, their leaves drawn with sharp, precise strokes. The once soothing hum in the background deepened, morphing into something less mechanical and more alive. I adjusted the volume, turning it up enough to hear the tiny noises hidden beneath Steve's voice. Faint whispers trickled through the static, unintelligible but urgent, like voices desperately trying to push through a locked door. My skin prickled. Then Steve stopped. His eyes met the camera, his smile faltering for the briefest moment. He whispered something under his breath, so faint I couldn't catch it even after I rewound it twice. It sounded almost like "not much time," before his eyes flicked away and he continued coloring. His smile returned, stretched wider, almost forced, as he filled in the spaces between the trees. Something shifted on the paper. It started subtly. The outlines of the trees seemed to twist, bending at unnatural angles. Their branches began to coil and knot, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like grasping hands. Then there were the shadows. At first they were just dark smudges among the trees, innocent enough. But as Steve's crayons swept across the page, they sharpened, taking on the forms of figures hunched among the branches. Each figure had no face, just hollow ovals where eyes should have been. Steve's hand faltered, the crayon slipping from his grasp and rolling off the table with a thud. He stared at it for a moment, the smile now entirely gone. Slowly, he turned back to the camera. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent, filling the room with a hissing cacophony. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and glistening, and whispered clearly this time, "Do you see them too?" The screen snapped to black and my living room plunged into silence. For a moment, I sat frozen, my eyes still glued to the dark screen. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, from somewhere in the house, I heard a noise. A gentle thud, like a crayon falling to the floor. The third tape felt heavier in my hands, as if the plastic shell itself knew what it contained. The unease from the previous episode hadn't faded, but against my better judgment, I needed to see more. I pressed play, and the screen flickered to life with a crackle that sent a chill down my spine. Steve appeared, his usual pastel backdrop looking more faded than before, almost bleached out. The smile he wore seemed more practiced now, more like a mask than ever. "Hello again, friends," he said, the cheer in his voice undercut by a tremor. "Today, we'll color something very special, a picture of family." His hand moved slowly, selecting a bright yellow crayon that seemed out of place amidst the deep hues he'd used before. He sketched the outline of three figurettes, a mother, a father, and a small child holding hands. The innocence of the image should have felt comforting, but instead it was suffocating. I leaned in, eyes narrowing as the static began to creep across the screen, disrupting the image. It started subtly, just a few brief pulses, but soon the static became more aggressive, cutting into the tape at erratic intervals. Each burst revealed flashes of unsettling scenes cracked, decaying buildings with shattered windows, hallways lined with peeling wallpaper, and a low, resonant whisper echoing over and over, "Find me." I gripped the arms of my chair, eyes locked on the screen. The family Steve was coloring seemed to change with each pass of his crayon. The bright yellows and pinks he used shifted suddenly, morphing into dark smears, as if ink had bled through the paper. The child's face began to twist, an expression of joy turning into something far more disturbing, a mouth open too wide, as if mid-scream. Steve paused again, looking into the camera. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression I could only describe as remorse. His eyes seemed to flicker with the static, caught between reality and whatever nightmare world leaked through the screen. "Do you remember?" he said, voice low and trembling. The static hissed louder, nearly drowning him out. "Do you remember what lies behind the colors? The truth hidden in plain sight." My heart raced as I leaned closer, breath shallow. The background behind Steve rippled, and for a second, it looked like something moved. A silhouette that stretched and distorted. It was tall and crooked, its limbs bending in impossible ways. The figure stood behind Steve, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, hollow eyes locked on the camera. Static crescendoed, consuming the screen, and the voices within it grew. I could almost make out their words, fragments of phrases layered over each other, lost always watching behind the colors. Then silence. The static vanished, and the screen returned to Steve, who was now frozen mid-stare, his eyes hollow and empty. I felt the hair on my arms rise as he whispered one final, bone-chilling sentence. "They're here." The tape ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark screen. But before I could move, a shiver ran down my spine as I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from behind me. "Find me." The box of tapes sat on the table like a silent challenge. I'd watched 3 so far, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. But now I noticed something strange. The numbering on the tapes wasn't sequential. Between some of them, numbers skipped ahead. Episode 4 jumped straight to 7, and others were missing entirely. My pulse quickened. Had someone removed these on purpose? What was hidden in the missing episodes? And why did it feel like each tape I did have was daring me to find out? I turned to the internet, hoping to find some trace of coloring with Steve, but my search came up empty. No records, no archived footage, not even a single mention on obscure forums. It was as if the show never existed. Frustrated, I called a friend who knew more about old TV programming than anyone I'd met. When I mentioned coloring with Steve, the line went silent. "Where did you hear about that?" he asked, his voice low, almost wary. "Old VS tapes from a garage sale," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause long enough to make me wonder if he'd hung up. It aired briefly on a local station in the 70s. They pulled it fast. No one really talked about it after that. "Listen, if you found something related to it, be careful. That show, it wasn't right." A chill ran down my spine as I hung up. I turned back to the tapes, fingers hesitating over the next one. I pushed it into the VCR and hit play. Steve appeared on screen. But this time, something was very wrong. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted to the corners of the frame as if watching shadows move. The pastel backdrop behind him was fractured, showing gaps where walls met unfinished floors, their surfaces rough and splintered. A stark cold light spilled in from somewhere off camera, cutting harsh lines across his face. "Hello," friends," he greeted, but his voice warbled, dipping unnaturally low, as though someone were playing with the audio. His smile twitched at the edges, more like a grimace now. "Today, we're going to learn about control and what happens when you lose it." My chest tightened as I leaned closer. The static interference was stronger, flickering in and out in brief but jarring bursts. Each time the static overtook the screen, I caught glimpses of dark, abandoned rooms, and what looked like scribbles scrawled frantically across walls. Steve's crayon moved sluggishly across the paper, creating shapes that barely resembled anything recognizable. His hand shook, and the lines bled outward, smearing the image as if it was coming apart at the seams. The background changed again, showing more of the space behind him. Wooden beams stretched upward, clawing at the darkness like fingers. In the corners, I could almost make out shapes, small and writhing just on the edge of perception. Steve's voice cracked as he spoke, his words barely making sense. "Behind the colors, there's truth. They tried to hide it, but it's always there, watching. Waiting." The static surged, louder and more ferocious than before, almost knocking me back. When it subsided, Steve was no longer at the table. He stood just behind it, eyes wild and face pale. The light behind him flared, showing dark smudges across the walls. Crude figures with eyes, rows upon rows of hollow, staring eyes. "Have you ever lost control?" he whispered, leaning so close to the camera that the screen filled with only his eyes, wide and glistening with terror. "They have." The tape cut to black abruptly, leaving me staring into the reflection of my own pale, frightened face. For a long moment, silence filled the room. But then, just as I began to exhale, I heard it again. The same soft, whispering voices I'd heard on the tapes. They were inside my house. I told myself I should stop, that I'd already gone too far. But it was like something had taken hold of me. Each time I watched, the tapes reached a little deeper, making me feel as though they were watching me back. When I pushed in the next tape, I felt a palpable dread, as if the air itself had thickened around me. Steve appeared, looking goner than before, his face paler, his eyes dull and lifeless. The familiar pastel backdrop was gone, replaced by a dull gray wall. For a moment I could swear the room behind him looked familiar. Too familiar. "Hello, friends," he began, his voice low and hollow, like it was coming from a distant place. "Today we're drawing a room, a very special room." His gaze felt direct, penetrating. It took everything in me not to avert my eyes. He started with the outline, a rectangle that gradually took form as he added more detail. There was a couch, coffee table, a lamp in the corner. My blood ran cold as I realized he was sketching my own living room. Every line was precise, down to the throw blanket on the sofa and the old rug near the door. My heart pounded as he continued, filling in each element with the same slow, deliberate strokes. As the crayon scratched across the paper, I felt an odd pressure in the room, like the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced around and froze. My furniture was shifting. The coffee table crept a few inches to the left, and the lamp flickered, its light dimming. I returned my gaze to the screen, gripping the chair to steady myself. Steve's hand slowed, and he paused, looking up with a smile that no longer seemed human. His eyes looked hollow, as if whatever spark of life had been there before was gone. "No, it's your turn," he said, voice metallic, distorted. "Draw with me, friends. Let's create something real." The moment stretched into silence. My hands itched, almost compelled to grab a pencil to follow along with his unnerving request. I shook my head, resisting, and his face twitched as though he could sense my hesitation. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible but somehow piercing. "It's better when you join in." I reached for the remote, my pulse racing. I had to see that last scene again to understand what was happening. When I rewound the tape, it stuttered, the screen flickering and distorting in shades of black and white. The VAs fought against my command, but I forced it back to the exact moment where he'd asked me to draw. The screen jumped, then steadied. Instead of Steve, I saw a new image. A grainy, nightmarish shot of a hand reaching out from within the screen. Its fingers twisted, pressing against the glass as though trying to escape. The skin was pale and cracked, nails dark and chipped. Grasping desperately, inches from my own face, I felt frozen in place, breathless, as the hand twitched and writhed, pushing harder against the screen with every passing second. A new voice, a woman's voice. echoed faintly through the static, panicked and weak, saying one word over and over: help. The screen flashed again, and Steve reappeared. His smile now stretched too wide, his eyes dark pits. He leaned closer, almost pressing his face into the lens, and whispered, "Once you start, you can never stop." The screen cut to black, and in the silence of my living room, I heard a soft scrape, like something scratching against the inside of the TV. Sleep had become a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of the tapes haunted me. Steve's hollow eyes, the hand reaching from the screen, the voices whispering my name. The darkness felt suffocating, as though it were pressing in on me, daring me to go back to the tapes. And, as if by some twisted compulsion, I did. My hands shook as I inserted the next tape and pressed play, feeling as if I was stepping over some final, irreversible line. Steve appeared, but this time he didn't pick up a crayon or even look at the table. He sat in silence, staring directly into the camera with an intensity that felt almost predatory. His once cheerful smile was gone, replaced by a grim line, and his skin looked waxy, nearly translucent. A chill seeped through the room as he opened his mouth, his voice lower than ever before. "Hello, Martin." I froze. My heart thudded painfully as mine echoed through the speakers, the sound almost crackling with distortion. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, some trick my mind was playing on me after too many sleepless nights. But his eyes bored into me, the screen warping slightly around his face as he spoke. "You've been watching," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you would. They knew you would." He tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. "Do you know about the dark room, Martin?" I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. My hands gripped the arms of my chair, knuckles white, as if bracing for impact. The screen flickered, momentarily obscuring Steve with bursts of static, and when the picture returned, he was closer, filling almost the entire frame. "The dark room is where they wait," he continued, his eyes unblinking, pupils wide and black. "It's behind the colors, beyond the screen. It's where the lost things go, where the eyes can't see." He lifted a hand slowly, pointing just past the camera, as though he could see through the screen and into my living room. "They see you, Martin," he whispered. "They've seen you since the first tape." The static surged again, and for a moment, the screen flickered, revealing what looked like a shadowed room. The walls were covered in crude, childlike drawings, faces scribbled in jagged lines, each one eyeless, scratched out with heavy strokes of charcoal. The drawings seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing, watching even without eyes. The camera returned to Steve, but his face was shifting. His eyes seemed to darken further, hollowing into voids that stretched and pulled at the edges of his face. He didn't blink, didn't move, as he stared unceasingly into the camera. "Do you know what they want, Martin?" he murmured, his voice now barely a thread of sound. "Do you want to be seen? To be let in?" The image distorted, lines rippling across his face as though he were dissolving. Behind him, the walls of his studio melted away, replaced by shadows that stretched endlessly into the darkness. I could almost make out shapes shifting within it, hands clawing toward the light, fingers pressing against some invisible barrier. They seemed close, too close. The camera zoomed in, closing in on Steve's face until his features blurred, his eyes becoming bottomless pits. He whispered one final sentence, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You can't stop now. Martin, you've seen too much. You're part of it now." Then he went silent, his face frozen, unblinking. The tape continued running, but he didn't move. His eyes held mine for what felt like hours, dark and empty, until the screen finally cut to static. The tape ended, but the silence felt wrong. Like a pause, like a breath being held. My eyes drifted to the TV, feeling like something was watching me back. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. And then, faintly, I heard it again. My own name, whispered from somewhere within the darkness of the screen. I told myself I wouldn't watch another tape. I'd even gone so far as to pack the whole box away in the attic, determined to get it out of sight, to break whatever spell it had over me. But it didn't matter. Each night felt the tapes calling to me, whispering in the back of my mind, clawing at my willpower. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my own name echoing in my head, feeling that same unnatural pull toward the tapes. By the third night, I was back in front of the TV, holding the next tape in my hands, numb and resigned. I pushed it into the VCR and braced myself as the screen flickered to life. Steve's image appeared, his expression more strained, as if he was fighting something inside of himself. The walls around him were darker now, and the light was dimmer, casting shadows that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He didn't greet the viewer this time. He simply picked up a crayon and began to draw. The paper in front of him showed the faint outline of a face, just the barest suggestion of features. He worked slowly, filling in the eyes first. But instead of drawing the typical cartoonish, happy eyes he usually gave his characters, these were dark, hollow voids, stretching deeper and deeper with each stroke of the crayon. A strange shiver ran down my spine as I watched, and the hairs on my arms prickled with unease. Steve's face remained expressionless, his hands moving methodically, almost mechanically, as he added twisted, unnatural smiles to each face. His humming started then, a tuneless, off-key lullaby that made my skin crawl. The sound was low, droning like a broken music box just on the edge of discord. The camera angle shifted, zooming in on the faces he was drawing. At first, they were unfamiliar, haunting strangers with voided eyes and ghastly smiles. But as he continued, my chest tightened. The faces began to look disturbingly familiar. The shape of the chin, the curve of the nose, the slight crook in a smile. Recognized these people. They were people I knew, my friends, my family. One by one, he drew them, distorting their expressions with each stroke, dragging their features into grotesque parodies of themselves. I clenched my fists, fingers digging into my palms as I saw my best friend's face emerge, his eyes dark, hollow pits. Then my brother, his mouth twisted into a sickly grin, the joy drained from his expression. My mother's face appeared next, and I felt a sharp pang of fear and anger. What was he doing? Why was he doing this? And then, with an unsettling calm, Steve began sketching the outline of a new face, the features somehow more familiar, more immediate, my own face. The crayon moved slowly, tracing the shape of my jaw, the slight crease of my brow, the set of my mouth. I watched, unable to breathe, as he filled in the eyes, two yawning voids that seemed to bore into my soul. My mouth was pulled into a hideous smile, a grin that felt like it belonged to a corpse. The humming grew louder, off-key and warbling, as if Steve was singing to himself from some dark, forgotten place. The static on the screen surged, and beneath it, I could hear something faint, screaming. Distant, distorted, layered over itself 1,000 times. A chorus of tormented voices that chilled me to the bone. Steve's hand stilled for a moment, his expression flat, almost serene. He lifted an eraser, holding it between his fingers with a reverence that seemed almost ceremonial. Slowly, he brought it down to the face on the paper, pressing it to my eyes first. The charcoal line smeared, blurring my face until the eyes were obliterated, leaving only an empty black void. With a detached calm, he erased the rest, one stroke at a time, until my face was nothing more than a shadow on the paper, a ghostly outline fading into nothingness. He looked up, his gaze meeting mine through the screen. For the first time, I saw the faintest glimmer of a smile. It wasn't his usual cheerful grin. This was something darker, something triumphant. The static swallowed the screen, and the tape ended, leaving me sitting in the dark, numb and hollow. The image of my erased face lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder that whatever this was, it had me in its grasp. And somewhere in the silence, just on the edge of hearing, I thought I heard my own name whispered. One last time. Martin. The envelope was tucked between the last tape and the bottom of the VHS box. I hadn't noticed it before, my hands trembling too violently as I'd hastily grabbed the tapes, driven by an almost animalistic need to see it all. But now, it was impossible to ignore. The yellowed paper was folded neatly, pressed in such a way that it felt like a secret had been buried inside. I hesitated before opening it, the weight of dread pressing down on me. I already knew it was a mistake, but I opened it anyway. Inside was a single page, a coloring book illustration. It was simple at first glance. Steve smiling, holding a crayon in one hand, a piece of paper in the other. His pastel-colored background was soft, inviting. A scene that seemed to promise the same innocence that the tapes had pretended to offer at the beginning. But there was something about his smile. It had changed just slightly in the way it was drawn. The edges were sharper, the eyes slightly more hollow, as if they were trying to escape from the paper. It was a drawing, yes, but it felt too real. too alive, as though the lines themselves were moving, shifting under the weight of something darker. I felt sick. I shoved the page back into the envelope, my hands trembling. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look away. I put the final tape in the VCR. The screen flickered as usual, and there he was, Steve. But he looked different this time. More ragged, more strained. His hair was disheveled, his clothes torn. The pastel background had all but vanished. Now, there was only darkness behind him, an endless void. The room where he once sat was gone. The soft colors were replaced by something much more sinister. The edges of the frame were blurred with an oily darkness, as though reality itself was fraying. "Hello, Martin," Steve said. His voice was barely recognizable, a low rasp as though it had been dragged through 1,000 miles of static. His eyes locked onto mine, as if he were looking directly at me through the screen. There was something unnatural about it, a pull that I couldn't explain. He didn't smile, not at first. Instead, his eyes were wide, too wide, stretching with something wrong. "Do you want to finish the picture, Martin?" he asked, his voice sliding through the static, sounding both distant and right next to me at the same time. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. I could feel my heart racing, the walls of my living room closing in around me. The room behind Steve began to bleed into the scene, not just on the screen but into my reality. The shadows began creeping out, like ink spilling from a page, black tendrils reaching into my own world. I heard it then, scratching, faint but growing louder, from inside the walls. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. It was like something was clawing at the plaster, scraping relentlessly, just beyond my reach. I could almost hear the shapes, the figures behind the walls, crawling toward me. They were coming. "Don't you see?" Steve's voice purred, not much closer. "You're already part of it. They are waiting for you." The screen flickered violently, static surging, distorting Steve's face. It warped, his features shifting and twisting, eyes bulging, mouth stretching into a gaping hole, teeth too sharp and jagged to count. The smile that had once seemed innocent now became a grotesque mask of hunger, the crayon in his hand twitching as though it had a life of its own. And then, the room behind him, the room in the show, was here. I could see it clearly, the shadows crawling over the walls, the crooked furniture, the scratches on the walls that hadn't been there before. The scratchings in the walls grew louder. They were inside my house now, inside me. The screen went black. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, breath shallow and ragged. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it. "You're part of it now," Steve whispered. The static hummed back to life, the image of Steve flickering. But now the screen was filled with only one thing. My reflection. It was me, sitting in the chair, staring blankly at the screen. My hands were clenched around a crayon. I hadn't even realized I'd picked it up. I was mirroring Steve's pose. My mouth was frozen in a twisted smile. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen. I couldn't look away, even as the sound of scratching filled the room, growing louder, closer. The picture of Steve in the coloring book changed again, his eyes now wide and hollow, his smile stretching unnaturally across the page. I had to finish it, but I couldn't stop drawing. I couldn't stop. The fluorescent lights in room 6013 never fully turned off. Even at night, they hummed faintly, casting everything in a sickly glow that made the shadows pool in strange corners. I'd been staring at them for hours, days. Time felt wrong here, stretched thin like old elastic that might snap at any moment. I woke up in this room a week ago. At least, that's what Dr. Evans told me. The first thing I noticed wasn't the industrial smell of bleach, or the metal bed frame bolted to the floor, or even the wire mesh embedded in the window glass. It was the water stain on the ceiling, a sprawling brown shape that sometimes looked like a face when my eyes unfocused. I tried not to look at it directly anymore. I'm pretty sure it blinks. And sometimes when I stare at it too long, the ceiling seems to stretch upwards, the room expanding into a vast, empty space with no walls and no end. But then I blink, and it's just a room again, small and suffocating. They say my name is Jane. Just Jane, like I'm some unclaimed thing that washed up on a shore. Dr. Evans told me this during our first session, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light in a way that made his eyes disappear completely. "You've experienced a traumatic event," he said, writing something in that leather-bound notebook he always carries. "A break from reality. We're here to help you piece things back together. But what pieces? My mind feels like an empty room, echoing with footsteps that might be memories. Or maybe it's the footsteps of someone outside my door, pacing back and forth, their rhythm as erratic as the beat of my own anxious heart. Every session starts the same way. Do you know why you're here, Jan? And every time I shake my head, watching his pen scratch across the page. They won't tell me. Not Dr. Venz. Not the nurses with their too tight smiles, not even the orderly who brings my medication 3 times a day. You'll remember when you're ready, they say. But ready for what? What could be so terrible that they'd rather let me sit here, drowning in questions, than just tell me the truth? The medication comes like clockwork. Yellow pills in the morning that taste like chalk and make everything feel slightly off-center. I arrange them on the bedside table before swallowing them, 3 in a perfect triangle, no more, no less. The blue ones at lunch turn the world underwater, and I have to count the bubbles that rise to the surface, making sure they're always an odd number. White ones at night that are supposed to help me sleep, but only seem to make the dreams more vivid. Dr. Evans says they'll help clear my mind, help me remember who I am. But lately, I'm not so sure I want to remember. Something about the pills bothers me. Yesterday morning, I noticed dark veins spreading from my fingers up my arm after taking the yellow ones. When I showed the nurse, she said my arm looked perfectly normal. But I can still see them, pulsing beneath my skin like black worms burrowing deeper, forming intricate patterns, perfectly symmetrical. The ward itself is what you'd expect from a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s. Long corridors with flickering lights, a common room where patients gather during the day, and the constant smell of industrial cleaner that never quite masks something underneath. Something metallic. Sometimes I catch myself thinking it smells like copper, like blood. There are other patients here, of course. Mrs. Albright sits in the corner of the common room, her gnarled fingers working endlessly at her knitting. Click, click, click. The nurses say she hasn't spoken in years, just sits there with those milky eyes fixed on nothing. But sometimes, when I walk past, I catch her staring at me, a flicker of recognition in her gaze that sends chills down my spine. Emily paces the halls, having conversations with empty chairs, her voice a high, pitched sing-song that sets my teeth on edge. Ms. Davis, the former professor, thinks she's Marie Antoinette. They're all lost in their own private hells, just like me. But at least they know why they're here. The dream started on my 3rd night. Just fragments at first, flashes of images and sensation that slipped away when I tried to focus on them. A kitchen with white tiles. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Something red spreading across the floor. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs like restraints. In the dreams, my hands are never empty. They hold a knife, a glint of silver in the harsh light, and the blade is always dripping, always perfectly clean. That's when I started noticing things. Little details that don't quite add up. Like how the number on my door sometimes reads 6014 when I'm sure it was 6013 the day before. Or how the emergency lights in the hallway cast shadows in impossible directions. Or how sometimes, late at night, I hear music. Beautiful, delicate music, like from an old music box. The first time I heard it, I followed the sound down the dark corridor. The emergency lights made everything look green and wrong, and the shadows seemed to move away from my feet as I walked. The music led me to a door I'd never seen before, tucked away in an alcove that seemed to bend the darkness around it. That's when I heard the warning. Just a whisper right behind my ear, "Don't touch it." I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back, the door was gone. Or maybe it was never there at all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my fractured mind. That's when the headaches started. Not normal headaches. These feel like something writhing behind my eyes, pressing against them from the inside. The pain comes in waves, each one bringing flashes of something. A kitchen knife catching fluorescent light. Red droplets hitting white tile. The coppery taste of blood in my mouth that won't go away no matter how many times I rinse. And with each wave of pain, the walls of the ward seem to dissolve, the faces of the other patients morphing into grotesque masks, their voices a cacophony of screams and whispers. I tried telling Dar Evans about it during our morning session. His pen stopped moving across the page, just for a moment, just long enough to make me wonder what he wasn't telling me. The light caught his glasses again. turning them into mirrors, and for a split second, I swear I saw something moving in their reflection. Something that wasn't in the room with us. The medications may take time to fully stabilize your perceptions, he said carefully, adjusting those reflective glasses. Try to focus on what you know is real. But how can I know what's real when my own body feels like it's betraying me? The black veins have spread past my elbows now, a web of darkness pulsing beneath my skin. Sometimes I catch them moving when I'm not looking directly at them, like they're trying to reach something, or escape something. And when I touch them, they writhe beneath my fingertips, as if trying to break free. Last night, I woke up to find my sheets soaked through. Not with sweat, with blood. But when I turned on the light, it was gone. Just like the door. Just like the veins whenever anyone else looks at them. Just like Emily, who disappeared 3 days ago. No one else seems to remember Emily. When I asked about her, the nurse looked at me strangely. "Who's Emily?" she said, checking my chart. But I remember her. I remember her conversations with empty chairs. I remember how those chairs were always cold. And I remember the sound she made the night she disappeared, not quite a scream, more like the noise a music box makes when you wind it too tight. The music box. I keep hearing it at night, its melody getting clearer, more insistent. Sometimes I catch myself humming along to a tune I shouldn't know. The other day, I found myself arranging my pills in perfect geometric patterns on my bedside table, just like the limbs of the woman in my dream. Her arms outstretched, her legs bent at precise angles, her head tilted just so. Perfect. That's when I started going to the library. It's small, just a few shelves of medical texts and outdated magazines, but it's quiet and the nurses rarely check on you there. At first, I was just trying to stay awake to avoid the dreams that kept getting more vivid, more real. Dreams of arranging things, making them perfect. Behind a shelf of psychiatric journals, I found a box of old newspapers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them, but the headlines burned themselves into my brain. Varsity Retapel Artemis Psychextiaficitiam, Femel Kaelar Taji Womanen, MSIXC Box of Mevar Piparm 1963. The articles were described a series of murders, 6 women, all found in their homes, posed like dolls around an antique music box. The killer had arranged them carefully, washing away the blood, dressing them in clean clothes, positioning their faces into serene, almost blissful smiles. In each case, the music box was found playing the same tune, a haunting, childlike melody that seemed to linger in the air long after the music box itself had fallen silent. The same tune I hear every night. The last article included a photograph of the music box, ornate brass and dark wood with delicate filigree around its edges. I recognized it instantly, though I couldn't say from where. Maybe from my dreams, maybe from somewhere else. A cold dread crept over me, a feeling of recognition that chilled me to the bone. When I went to put the papers back, I noticed something dark seeping from behind the wall panel. At first, I thought it was just water damage, but when I touched it, my fingers came away sticky. Red. The panel shifted under my hand, revealing a narrow space behind it. Inside was a notebook. Not Dara. Evans' leather-bound one. This was older, the pages yellow and brittle. The handwriting inside looked like mine, but the dates were from 1963. Entry after entry describing the most perfect arrangements, the most beautiful smiles, the most wonderful music. July 14th. The music guided my hands. She was so much more beautiful this way, at peace. Faugustund. He struggled. It was messy, but the music calmed him. They all find peace eventually. September 10th, 3 this time. A family. They look so happy now, forever frozen in a moment of joy. The notebook fell from my trembling hands. The memories weren't fragments anymore. They were flooding back in perfect, crystalline clarity. Every detail, every arrangement, every beautiful pose. The metallic scent of blood, the feel of cold skin, the way the light glinted off the blade. I remember now. I remember everything. It started with my dollhouse when I was 7. Everything had to be just so. The tiny furniture arranged at perfect right angles. The little family posed in flawless tableaus. Mother in the kitchen, father in his study, children at the table, each one positioned with mathematical precision. If anyone moved them, even slightly, I'd feel tightness in my chest. This unbearable wrongness that wouldn't go away until everything was perfect again. As I got older, the need for perfection grew. My room was immaculate, books arranged by height and color, hangers exactly 1 inch apart, Bed corners folded at precise 45-degree angles. The world outside was chaos, but in my space, everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. The first one wasn't planned. She was my roommate, and she was so messy. Dishes left in the sink, clothes strewn about, picture frames hanging crooked. I tried to fix things while she slept, but she always ruined it. Always brought chaos back in my perfect order. The music box was playing that night. My grandmother's antique music box that I'd wound up to help me sleep. Such a pretty tune. When I saw my roommate's body sprawled at such an ugly angle, I knew what I had to do. I arranged her perfectly, each limb at exactly the right angle, expression peaceful, serene, beautiful. The music box played while I worked, its melody guiding my hands. After that, I couldn't stop seeing the imperfection everywhere. All those people live in their chaotic, asymmetrical lives, but I could fix them. I could make them perfect just like me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The library seemed to tilt and sway around me, the books on the shelves blurring into indistinct shapes. The music box melody echoed in my ears, growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around to find Dr. Evans standing behind me, his face pale and drawn. "Jane," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." "Dark." Evans' grip on my shoulder tightened as the room seemed to ripple around me. The library shelves flickered like static on a broken screen, and for a moment, I felt like I was falling. But not in my body. It was a deeper kind of disorientation, like my mind had been peeled back layer by layer, leaving nothing but raw nerves. "I remember now," I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "I killed them. I killed all of them." Dr. Venz nodded slowly, his glasses catching the light in that unnerving way that erased his eyes. "Wes, Jane, you did. And we've been trying to help you see that for a very long time." The library dissolved in an instant. No slow fade, no gradual dimming, just a blink, and it was gone. I was in a concrete room, stark cold and brutally real. The walls were bare, save for the faint scratches I'd apparently carved into the surface over the years. Tiny music notes etched in jagged lines. My breath caught as I looked down at my hands. The black veins were gone, the pulsing patterns replaced by pale skin marred with faint scars and calluses. I was wearing a prison jumpsuit, bright orange, stiff against my skin. Across from me, Dr. Evans, if that was even a metal stool, a thick folder resting on his lap. There was no notebook, no pen, no wire-rimmed glasses, just a clipboard and a tired, resigned expression on his face. "We're? Where's room 6013? I croaked, the words clawing their way out of my throat. "Dark." Evans didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a black and white photograph and sliding it across the table. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo showed a body, posed on the ground in a grotesque tableau, arms and legs bent into inhuman angles. Her face was serene, her lips curved into a faint, unnatural smile. A music box sat beside her, its lid open, though I couldn't hear its melody anymore. "That was your first victim?" Dr. Evans said softly. "Your roommate? Hannah Brooks. You arranged her like a doll in your grandmother's music box. You even left a note, calling her your most beautiful creation. Do you remember that now?" I nodded, my stomach churning. The memory was there, sharp and vivid, no longer buried under layers of dreamlike haze. But the room still felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were mocking me. "And the others?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Evans sighed, sliding more photos across the table. Each one was worse than the last. A woman on her kitchen floor, limbs outstretched at geometric angles. A man in his living room, his face turned toward the camera with a blissful smile painted on his lips. A family of 3 arranged around a dining table, their lifeless bodies posed as if mid-conversation. "You called it art," Dr. Evans said, his voice heavy. "The newspapers called you the music box murderer. Do you remember what you told the judge at your trial?" I shook my head, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to remember. "You told the court you weren't guilty because they weren't dead to you. You said they were perfect now, that you'd brought them peace." The jury didn't agree. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "That was 12 years ago, Jane. And no matter how many realities your mind invents to protect you, the truth doesn't change. You're not in room 6th and 30. You're in solitary confinement awaiting execution. My pulse roared in my ears, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "No," I murmured, shaking my head. That's not possible. I was in the hospital. There were other patients. Mrs. Albright. The music box. None of it was real. Dr. Evans interrupted, his voice cold now. "You've been living inside your own mind, creating scenarios to avoid facing what you did. The hospital was a construct, a way for you to pretend you were the victim. But the truth is, you're here, on death row, and your execution is scheduled for tomorrow morning." I staggered back in my chair, the metal scraping loudly against the concrete floor. "No," I said again, my voice rising. "I don't believe you." Dr. Evans stood, tucking the folder under his arm. "You don't have to believe me, Jane. The clock doesn't care if you accept reality or not." He knocked twice on the heavy steel door behind him. It groaned open, and 2 guards stepped in, their faces expressionless. As they moved toward me, I caught a glimpse of the hallway beyond. Long, gray, and empty, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Room 63. It wasn't a hospital ward. It had never been a hospital ward. It was my cell number, the numbers bolted to the steel door that had been my entire world for over a decade. As the guards hauled me to my feet, the faint melody of the music box crept into my mind again, unbidden. I hummed it under my breath as they led me down the corridor, each step echoing like the ticking of a clock. Tomorrow, I would die. But as the guards opened the heavy door to the execution chamber, I saw not the sterile gurney I'd expected, but a room full of people. They were all staring at me, their faces familiar. Mrs. Albright, Emily, Miss Davis, and they were smiling. On one dark, foggy morning, a news station began the daily evening broadcast to Sevier County, a low, population area in the middle of nowhere. It began with a poppy intro song, canned footage of various county locales, and fast-forwarded time lapses of the weather. When the intro wrapped up, the station's logo appeared briefly on the screen before taking position at the lower left corner. The screen showed footage of the child's home, a wide panning shot of a well, kept front yard covered in yellow caution tape and strobing with red and blue police lights. One small boy, who lived in a very poor home and had nothing better to do besides play with Legos in front of the living room TV, noticed something. "What's that?" the boy asked his mother, who sat in a recliner behind him reading a novel. The mother marked her place in the book and looked around for her glasses that were nowhere nearby before giving up and squinting at what her son was pointing to on the TV. "What's what?" she asked. The boy said, pointing to the field beyond the child's yard. "What is that?" "A horse field," the mother said simply. The field is a flat stretch of land next to the child's house with only a few salt blocks and trows spotted around. Even through the static of the TV, wisps of fog and frosted grass are easily visible. Their neighbors had a few horses that walked around that field all day. "Not that," the boy said, then pointed to a specific spot in the field. "That." The mother shrugged, took another doomed look for her glasses, and searched the screen again. For 1 second, she thought she could see a rough shape in the mist at the far end of the yard. Before she can get a closer look, the screen goes back to the newscasters. "I'm sorry, Bud. I didn't see anything." The next morning, the Sevier County News intro kicked off at 7 a.m. with the same canned footage of rolling clouds and cheaply animated logo. The newscasters wear inexpensive clothing and shuffle empty papers on their table. "Good morning, Sevier County. This is James Bergernand. Audrey Rasmussen here to give you a quick morning update before the day's scheduled programming." Kicking things off, Audrey continued. "And as you've probably noticed, a heavy fall-time fog has set in around the Sevier County area. Though fog is common this time of year, in some areas it's thick enough to stop traffic. Local meteorologist Jason Whitman, says James, has informed us that due to the cold weather and thickness of the fog, it may not dissipate until later in the week. All residents should travel with caution, including using your headlight brights and walking with reflective material." For a brief update on the ongoing investigation into the suicide of Madeleine Childs, we have Kenna Spears down for a brief interview with Richard and Evelyn Childs at Malian Elementary. The image cuts to a young lady in a PBS Channel 3 sweater standing in front of Malian Elementary. Behind her is a thin, tired-looking man with unkempt hair, a 5 o'clock shadow, and heavy shadows under his eyes. He lightly holds a little girl by the shoulders. The girl is the spitting image of her father, the only difference being even more pronounced shadows under her eyes. While the reporter is very well lit by the news camera's huge lights. The two behind her are almost shapes in the darkness until the light is swung towards them. Only one child in the county is watching the live report, a young girl home with a bad cold. Why are they doing this? She thinks as she bundles into her blankets and pillows and watches the TV in her room. That girl looks so sad. Kenna Spears, on her 4th day of what she thought was going to be a fun and exciting internship, starts her report. "Good morning, Sevier County," Kenna Spears says, smiling a wide smile that looks extremely out of place. The fog is so thick that the world outside of the intensely bright camera light seems to be entirely an inky purple. The only outlier is a row of classroom windows behind Richard and Evelyn filled with dim light. But even those are so distant and penetrating to the fog that they look like phantom gaslights. "I'm here with Richard and Evelyn Childs," Kenna says before slowly walking with the camera towards the two. "Husband and daughter of Madeline Childs." Richard winces. Evelyn frowns. Kenna either doesn't notice or doesn't care. Dropping to one knee, she speaks to Evelyn while holding a large microphone close to the child's face. "Evelyn, how are you doing?" she asks with a wide smile still on her face, from what could only be a very warped sense of professionalism. "All this fog is pretty creepy, right? What a day to come back to school." Evelyn smiles a little and nods. Richard rubs her shoulder lightly. "We just wanted to say that we're glad to see you doing well," Kenna says after an awkward pause. She's about to say more before Evelyn abruptly turns to her father, hugs him, and runs towards the school. The sick girl bundled in blankets at home smiles, happy that the girl got away. Kenna Spears frowns, resets her Fox broadcast smile, and approaches Richard for an interview that the county sheriff had been very adamant to him that he make. Kenna is about to speak when a loud, shrill scream cuts her off. In the footage, those few who happen to be watching see Evelyn running back to her father. The sick girl at home begins to scream as she sees what Evelyn is running from. It's her. Evelyn screams, over and over. "It's her! It's her! It's hearer!" Richard picks up Evelyn and moves toward the camera's light. It's the only thing even moderately bright and easily visible around. Kenna Spears freezes, too confused and inexperienced to do anything more than stand and stare at where Evelyn had run from. All she, the cameraman, and Richard can see is a vague outline of the school, except a silhouette in the fog. The adults stare dumbfounded while Evelyn and the sick girl at home scream. "What is?" the reporter asks. She approached the silhouette. Before she could get close, the form in the fog abruptly moved, the mist quickly billowing towards Kenna, before the reporter was lifted off of the ground. Kenna's thoughts were not coherent. All she could be aware of were what felt like fingers as cold as ice around her throat. The pressure tightened, harder and harder, until she could feel an explosion of pain, blood and collapsing trachea in her throat. There's a flash of unbearably intense pain, then Kenna's on the ground. People are screaming and running. The one light in the fog topples over and the camera crumples. Both the footage and the light cut off and everything is dark. Kenna barely notices. She's trying desperately to take breaths through a shattered throat. She feels her chest soak in a warm liquid and wonders what it could be. The cameraman appears, yelling, trying to tell her something as he hovers over her, looking terrified into their surroundings. Something was surrounding them, but all Kenna could see was fog. Before she can see what the cameraman is looking for, Kenna Spears loses consciousness and dies on the 4th day of her exciting new internship. The cameraman does not notice. At the moment of her death, the same icy cold fingers wrap around his throat and drag him, kicking but unable to scream, deeper into the fog. In the next few hours, the entire town of Maylene went into lockdown. A few bodies belonging to those unlucky enough to be outside of their homes and around the school that morning, including the sheriff of Maylene and his 2 deputies who had been keeping a close eye on Richard, are unseen in the dense fog. The attack had taken place early enough in the morning so that only 20 or so children were at Maylene Elementary. They had all been quickly evacuated to the library. They'd all waited, but help didn't come. Richard Childs was alone in an empty classroom while Evelyn waited in the library. The room offered no comfort. The minuscule desks and chairs looked odd with the brightness of the lights and the darkness outside. Colorful stickers of various objects with cartoonish eyes seemed to glare at him. Sitting in the teacher's chair and putting his head on the desk, he did his best to ignore everything else and draw 5-pointed stars on a blank piece of paper. Except all that he saw was Madeline. He wanted to be in the library, wanted to be with his daughter, but it was better this way. Better to be here alone than to stress out the kids old enough to recognize the man on the news who had abused his now deceased wife. Or was she? The thought kept coming back to him. That's what Evelyn had said. It had been her. His mind had already been strained for years. He thought it had snapped after he found Madeleine's body sitting against the tree in the front yard, smiling spitefully even in death. Everything's going to be okay, he told Evelyn as they both sat in their house waiting for the cops to arrive. It was a paper, thin platitude, and they'd both known it. He said it again when the sheriff led him to the squad car. The pitying look Evelyn had given him as he was handcuffed made him want to rip his hair out and scream. To hell with the news cameras and reporters watching. Those promises, the lies, had caught up to him. As he stared into the shifting darkness outside of the classroom window, it made a sort of karmic sense. The lies had replayed in his head since he'd been interviewed by the sheriff. "I love you" had been the first. He'd said it after his and Madeleine's first kiss. She'd been expecting it after all, wouldn't want to disappoint his first love. She'd told the same lie to him every time the fighting had died down and they lay on the bed or couch. Sometimes she'd even cry to show him how remorseful she felt after treating him the way she did, promising she'd get help and start treating him better. But after Evelyn had been born, Madeleine had gotten physical. Richard picked himself up, wiping his puffy eyes with the back of one hand and putting the pencil he'd been doodling with in the other, and left the classroom, deciding that he didn't care how others thought of him. He wanted to be near Evelyn. The stepping of his shoes echoed around him as he walked towards the library. The lights were off, the dark brick hallways seeming out of a nightmare. What if those things made it into the school? But that was impossible. He and the teachers had made sure there was no getting into the building. Right? Even that much was assuming anything about this situation was logical. At the library door window, he could see that most of the children were collected on a large rug that displayed Earth's continents. A few teachers sat on chairs around the kids, forming a protective circle. Kids and adults watched a tape of Schoolhouse Rock. There were stickers everywhere of flowers, rainbows, and books with large cartoonish eyes that looked haunting in the dim TV glow. Evelyn was at the back with the older kids, and she was the first to see him. "Dad," she said, so loud and abruptly that everyone in the room jumped. She was up and running across the room, everyone watching her in stunned silence. She threw open the door and hugged his waist. "Are you doing okay?" he asked, kneeling down to be eye to eye with his daughter. "Not really," she said with heartbreaking exhaustion. "Are you?" "Yeah," he said, hoping it was true. "Miss Clausen wants to talk to you," Evelyn said, pointing to the teachers sitting at a table in the corner of the room. "Okay, sweetie, sit tight." He wasn't sure which one was Clausen at first, until he saw the oldest woman sitting at the far end of a long rectangular table with a particularly harsh glare aimed right at him. She motioned for him to join the teachers at the table. Each of the teachers gave him varying degrees of caution as he found a seat. Some just seemed cautious, most looked outright hostile. Doing his best to ignore them, he sat down and stared at the table, not knowing what to do with himself. He felt all of their eyes boring into him. "Mr. Childs," asked Miss Clausen quietly, easily the oldest teacher at the table. She was a beady-eyed and permanently scowling woman that Richard kept as tight a grip on her classroom as she could. "Wes." He did his best to smile, but only barely managed to soften his frown. "Did you kill your wife?" For an instant he was back in the sheriff's tiny interrogation room. The deputies crammed uncomfortably behind the sheriff's desk, all three looking like they'd pulled in a psycho murderer after a rampage. They'd put him in a small chair against the far wall and made sure to constantly let him know that. No matter what it looked like, he had been free to leave at any time. No. The teachers all glanced at each other, as if a bit surprised the homicidal maniac they'd built in their heads could speak. He supposed this was fair. He hadn't spoken to any of them when they'd been making sure the school's doors were locked. Did you beat her? Another teacher, this one a man in his late 30s, asked very timidly before remembering that he was supposed to be acting as an adult parental figure before less timidly adding, "The news said there were bruises." Bruises on her wrists and shins, Richard finished. "She left a lot more bruises on my gut and back from the effort. I promise." "Why was that?" Clausen asked. He could feel the tendons on his neck stretch as he bit his tongue, anger flooding into his veins as he remembered everything Madeleine had done. The anger wasn't even towards the teachers or the sheriff's deputies when they had asked. It was towards himself. "She liked to fight," he said when he'd relaxed himself. Clausen held her gaze. "Care to explain what you mean, Mr. Childs?" "No." The teachers all shared shocked glances. This whole thing was starting to prickle his nerves. "Look," he said. "I just wanted to make sure everyone was all right. I sure as hell didn't come here to get interrogated again." "Mr. Childs," Clausen said, her face softening just enough to show Richard that behind the gruff, stern exterior was an old woman who was desperately tired and scared for the children in the room. "We just want to make sure you aren't a risk to the children." It was clear that some of the teachers, specifically the prissy young man who'd spoken up earlier, still weren't convinced that he wasn't a threat. That was fine with Richard. He didn't give a shit what they thought. "That only leaves me with one question, Mr. Childs," Noreen said, rubbing her eyes. "Do you have any idea what in the Sam Hill is going on?" "No," he answered honestly. It was still hard to believe anything that happened was real, but he'd seen the reporter's throat bulge as something lifted her from the ground. And what Evelyn had said, it's her. "My daughter says she saw it," he said. "Whatever did that to the reporter? She said the thing looked like her mother. I believe her." Stunned silence. "That's insane," the young male teacher said. "You're insane." "Misser Benson," whispered Mrs. Clausen, so sharp and so loud that most of the kids glanced toward the adults at the table. Mr. Benson squirmed into his chair. Richard had thought Clausen's eyes had been beady and penetrating before. Now they were sharp enough to make the most behaved college senior with her. "You forget," she continued, much more quietly, "that I saw the murder happen myself. That before the murder happened, some of the kids were talking about adults walking around the school that none of the teachers could see. Do you doubt me?" "No, Noreen," Benson stammered, "just don't think it's logical to." "Benson," Clausen said, "you said you were the only one to see what happened to the cameraman. Is that still true?" Benson went pale, so pale that Richard thought that all of the blood might have drained out of his face. "Putting that aside," Clausen said very pointedly towards Benson, who shrank even farther back into his chair, "we need to find a way to contact the authorities. It's clear they—" Richard felt something at the very edge of his senses, a feeling. The others at the table must have heard it as well. They'd all gone quiet and pale with quizzical looks on their faces. Richard turned in his seat to get eyes on Evelyn. She was looking towards the windows. All of the children were. The light of the TV cast shadows around their faces as they looked, as if wearing dark masks to hide their terrified expressions. "Ghosts," an older child near Richard whispered. "Lake-white statues." The younger children began to cry. Outside, several shapes had begun to move through the fog towards the windows. The mist clung so tightly as they moved that a myriad of human silhouettes could be intuited. At the front, moving very fast and energetically between the windows and foggy figures, was Madeleine. Richard didn't know how he was sure. Maybe the wisps trailing her figure in the fog was just distinct enough for him to tell the shape of her. Regardless, he was sure. That was her. Mum. Evelyn. She stood next to him, looking at the figures. The animated figure stopped, and Richard thought he could see its head move toward the sound of Evelyn's voice. "Why?" Evelyn asked. A puzzled look, not only from Evelyn, but also from some of the kids near to the windows. "That doesn't make sense," Evelyn said. "I thought you said." Evelyn reached towards the glass as she spoke. Richard was about to stop her when the windows exploded. Everyone in the room screamed. Richard threw himself in front of Evelyn, tried to tell her to run. Warm fingers closed around his throat, cutting off his words. The teachers rushed to push the kids against the furthest wall in the library. The kids were still screaming so loud that Richard couldn't hear himself think. From his right, Clausen and Benson ran to him, throwing their weight into whatever held Richard. Both crashed into the invisible figure like a wall, the grip around Richard only getting tighter. At one point he saw Benson jab at the thing with a very sharp pencil. It exploded uselessly. A few of the other teachers fell onto the invisible thing choking him, but each of their blows bounced off. Richard remembered his own pencil that he'd put in his pocket earlier from his time in the other room, collecting himself. To hell with it, he thought. Even if it was a useless effort, he wasn't going down without a fight. Not anymore. He gripped the pencil so hard it almost snapped and stabbed it towards the fingers on his throat. The pencil hit its mark and went deep. Cold, unseeable liquid spilled over his hands before he could go for another hit. His vision went crazy and his body went weightless. The back half of his body slammed into something hard, knocking what little air was in him out of his lungs.
Mo!
When his vision had just barely begun to refocus, he saw something fly out of the windows that had just been broken into. Evelyn screamed as she was pulled into the fog and out of sight. The other figures in the fog followed, all floating silently while the sound of Evelyn's scream faded. The shortest walk to where Evelyn's screaming had trailed off the teacher's parking lot was through the combination auditorium gymnasium. The exit was one he'd locked himself when they'd been sweeping the school when this all started. Why did Madeline come through then? She easily could have if she was powerful enough to shatter the library windows. Was this all a part of her game, her amusement? Had she purposefully given time for him and everyone else to be terrified and at her mercy before she took it to hell with her? It was likely, he realized as he found the exit and took his first step out into the fog. Even when they'd been kids, she'd lauded any sort of victory she could over him. Back then it had all been in good fun, hadn't it? The mist crawled through the dark doorway behind him. The air was cool, damp, and had an odd metallic taste to it. The drizzle that had been over the town for days was gone, but it had left a very wide, very thin pool of water that covered the entire lot. He couldn't see all of it, but what he could reflected the mist into a gray mirror that lay flat across the lot. His feet almost seemed to be stepping into a void of mist that rippled at his every move. Richard felt he should be scared, but he wasn't. Not at first. His instinct to get his daughter back overrode everything else. It only waved when he saw feet, shaped holes in the water at the very edge of his limited vision. There was a quick motion, more ripples on the water, and then the feet were facing away from him. He could see the black tar, like surface of the lot under the feet, shaped holes. Fear was in him then, rushing back into him as he encountered more and more foot shapes in the water. Whenever he came even slightly into his limited visibility, there would be a quick motion that sent cascades of ripples across the mirror he seemed to stand on, and then the feet would be pointing away from him. There was Evelyn, standing rigid and silent as far off in the fog as he could see. Splash, 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 something slammed into his back. His vision blurred as his body fell forward and slammed into the ground, his head and stomach slamming hard into the pavement. The air in his lungs was squeezed out of him. Instinctively, he tried to pull air back in, and his throat was met with gravelly rainwater. In a daze, choking and spitting, he raised himself onto his knees. The fog around him was all at once nauseating and hard to get a grip on. It felt like he was in hell, playing with your toys. Oh, Maddie. He stood, straining his ears for the same splashes she'd caused before. It was almost impossible. Every time he turned his head, the other invisible things turned away, causing ripples and splashes that overtook any of Madeline's, if she was even making any. Splash, splash. Something slammed into his shoulder. She was in front of him now, and easy to track. But what now? She could bleed, even if it was impossible to know what she bled. But how could he get to her and Evelyn without putting his daughter in danger? A shame that our last fight would be to the death. It was probably what she'd wanted. Why she'd done whatever she had done to get an army of figures in the mist to do her bidding. Even if he was going to die, he'd hoped there was a way to be sent off flipping that bitch a middle finger. There was a humor in that he was still playing into her game. Humor, that's it. It was so simple. He laughed. It started slow, forced and horrifying in its own right. He forced a laugh anyway, all of his chuckles almost sounding like sobs. A memory came to him. The looks Madeline had given whenever he went out with coworkers without her permission. The annoyed glances when Evelyn had chosen to be with her father instead of her mother. Even the frown he would see on Maddie's face whenever he found good company, away from her at family parties. The fake horrible chuckles started to come out easier. Boy, I tell you, Richard said to himself, if I took my wife to a dog show, I think she'd win first prize. Now he was really laughing. So hard that he thought he wouldn't be able to get air back into his lungs if he tried. There was nothing to laugh at before, but now there was. Whatever the white things were, whatever Madeline had done to bring her him here, was a fickle, easily manipulated thing that was not only beyond Richard and Evelyn's understanding, but of Madeline's as well. Dad, Evelyn asked, her fear entirely overshadowed by her shock. She was about to say something else when her eyes went wide. She looked around where the ghost stood in the water. On the other side of the school, Noreen Clausen was finally getting a connection to the police station on her cell phone. Benson was nearby standing with the other teachers in front of the kids, all of whom had been packed into the corner like it was a standard school lockdown. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a few of the kids look towards the windows. None of the figures in the mist had followed them to the room, but Benson's nerves still froze. "What is it?" he asked. "People laughing," one of them said. Benson strained his ears. He heard nothing, but at the very end of his senses. For just a second, he thought he could feel something. Richard couldn't hear louder besides his own, but like Benson had, he felt them. All of the other white things that had come for him with Maddie, they were laughing with him. Straight ahead of him, two of the footholds turned towards him. Madeline. He watched her take a few steps around the other invisible things, all of who were still facing away from Richard as they laughed. He could picture her looking at what she thought had been her allies, or even just her temporary companions with bewildered rage. In one last deliciously petty move, he put one hand to his straining stomach and the other pointed at her. By then, he was laughing harder than he ever had in his life. Suddenly the footsteps were thundering towards him. Every step was heavy and clumsy, spraying water all over the place. A lot of the water hit the invisible white things, and rivulets of water ran down them, giving them shape. His louder stopped. Richard's hand went to his pocket and back out just in time for his late wife to make contact. The choice for weapons in a school library had been almost non-existent, and why his attack had hurt her when nothing else would remain a mystery to him forever, but it was all he had. 3 sharpened pencils. Again the pencil sank in, and he felt the cold liquid run down his fingers again for an instant before the full weight of her crashed into him, sending them both crashing into the ground. He tried to breathe in, and almost did, before a force that could only have been Madeline constricted and pushed on his entire body. I'm going to die. A part of him was ready to die. That part of him wanted nothing more than to let something that he'd continued to ignore and, in a way, foster, just let him rest. Let him finally be done with everything. Deity. Seeing black spots in his vision, he brought his hands from their awkward angle underneath his back and wrapped them around Madeline's invisible form. Jet, he said, his hands gripping her head. The hell. He stood, lifting both of their weights off of the ground, slowly and struggling but surely. Oh, he took the second pencil from his pocket and hammered it into the invisible form's throat. It disappeared into her all the way up to the eraser of my life. With one last effort, he threw her away. Madeline's body hit the ground hard, making a crater the shape of her body in the water. The other foot-shaped craters in the water turned towards Madeline. Madeline raised her arm, the water instantly pooling into the empty space as she lifted it. It fell back in with one last pathetic splash. Evelyn ran into him then, wrapping her arms around and burying her face in his jacket. She was crying too, but quietly, keeping her eyes just dry enough to watch her mother leave for the final time. It happened very quickly. One moment the body-shaped crater was there, Then it wasn't, filled with the reflective rainwater that still covered the lot and still filled with dozens of white things, all pointed towards Richard and Evelyn. Then, without a word or sign of any kind, the figures in the water turned away from them in the school and left. Their steps were silent, and their ripples were many. The image of their craters forming in the water as they walked away and into the fog was one that never left Richard or Evelyn. Fame is a fickle thing. It's not often that the most talented or most impressive person in their field becomes the most famous. For every famous person, there's 100 with a bigger resume who never got the recognition. The same, morbidly, is true of serial killers. You'd think the biggest ones would be the worst ones. Why would they be the most famous or infamous if they weren't the baddest? But then you look harder, and you realize you were only scratching the surface. Depravity runs deep. Evil's roots spread wide. Everywhere that people exist, bad people exist too. They always have and they always will. Some are loud and some are quiet. Sometimes it's the ones that don't get talked about, the ones under the radar that are the worst. The ones working in the shadows. Black-Eyed Susan was the moniker of a serial killer in and around my hometown of Willow Bay, Nova Scotia. You can guess why they were not all that well known, because where the hell is Willow Bay, Nova Scotia? For those unaware, Nova Scotia is a maritime province on the east coast of Canada, and Willow Bay is a quaint little coastal town on the lower west side. It sits within a larger area in Nova Scotia called Annapolis Valley, which is locally referred to as just the Valley. It's beautiful and scenic, full of vast prairies and beaches. You can see the stars year-round. There's good fresh air, lots of friendly people. There's an apple festival, it's great. The valley is a place where people like to settle down. Many retirees and families will come to escape city life and live out their days peacefully. Many others are born here and just can't imagine leaving. It's the kind of place where you don't think evil can exist. Sure, it's a little more old school and religious than other places, a little bit backwoods here and there. Hunting rifles are commonplace, teeth are less so. There's violence and cruelty just like anywhere else. Many a drunken fight or a schoolyard hazing, there were rough types and creeps. But we didn't get evil. We didn't get kidnappers or mass shooters, definitely not serial killers. Except for Black-Eyed Susan. That was a name we all knew about. Growing up was just a name. The name of an old local boogeyman. We never really learned or bothered to look much into the real story. We'd pick up bits and pieces, but parents tended to avoid mentioning it. All we really had were the fantastical legends conjured up by teenagers to scare their younger siblings. It spread around the schoolyard like wildfire. The real story, such as it was this: his victims were all young women, aged 15 to 18, and yes, I said hiss. The words, for Black-Eyed Susan, would be found carved somewhere on all of his crime scenes, and the papers ran with it before they knew his real identity. He was found responsible for 6 murders over the course of 10 years, but had been suspected in the disappearances of at least 8 others throughout the valley. His methods were bizarre and seldom written about. Much was left up to speculation about what his victims actually endured while in his captivity. Those who went missing would be gone for months, and when found, would only have been recently deceased. They would be found artistically displayed, often in Christ, like poses hung up and coiled within trees, vines, and flowers. Sometimes flowers would be found within the bodies themselves. It's unclear whether they were placed there, or if he had actually somehow planted them inside the body. Their eyes would be missing, as would their brain and several other vital organs, including the uterus. They appeared to be removed surgically, post-mortem. Their blood was also drained. He turned himself in and confessed to the confirmed murders in 2004, his real name revealed to be Darren Barbeau. He refused to comment on any of the other disappearances that he was implicated in. Within his first week in prison, he suffered a brain aneurysm and died. He was 62. That's the profile of Black-Eyed Susan. Those are the facts. Darren Barbeau was a sick, vile, and truly evil man who destroyed many lives and caused untold pain to the community for many years, and he died before he was able to truly face justice what he did. Unfortunately, that is only the beginning of the story. What he really did to these girls, what it was all for, and the things I saw when I became involved, paint an even darker and more impossible picture. One that defies comprehension, sanity, and everything I used to believe to be reality. One that I am still struggling to put together. I'll start at the beginning. The three of us grew up in the early 2000s. Black-eyed Susan was gone by the time we were 6. I don't remember much of life while he was still around. I can only speculate on the fears and anxieties of the adults in our life. We were inseparable. I met Emily in grade 4, and we instantly became best friends. Then around grade 5, we sort of adopted Heather. We had other friends on the side here and there, but it was really just the three of us from that point on. We hung out almost every day. We talked about everything, we laughed together, and we cried together. It made the three of us friendship bracelets with all our names. We were sisters. I wanted to call us the Hell Sisters because of our names, Heather, Emily, and Leela, but Emily's dad was a pastor, so that never went public. I'd like to say we got into mischief, but that was mostly all me. Em and Heather were the good kids, though they could not be more different. Heather was tough. Heather was the one who finished the fights that I started. Her hair was an impossible orange mess from day one and could not be fixed. Her skin would be completely ghostly white if it wasn't almost constantly burnt. She was a country girl through and through. Her parents owned a farm, and they put her to work since she was a fetus, but she never complained. She tended to keep to herself a lot. She had no friends when Em and I came along, but we loved her immediately. We did stop going to her house, though, because her parents would try to get us to help out around the farm, and we simply could not handle it. Em was a dainty little thing. She was the blonde princess that every uptight Christian parent dreams of. Her father took great care to mold her into that image, and I took great pride in being a horrible influence on her. She was well-mannered, obedient, and ridiculously sheltered, but I can't say they didn't do anything right because she was truly the sweetest girl on the planet. It was almost annoying how positive and lovely she was, but I couldn't help but absolutely adore her. I was eternally compelled to protect her, and so was Heather. As for me, I wasn't tough like Heather, and I wasn't sweet like Em, but I was the one who could take all the shit. When we got in trouble, Em and Heather would get scared, so I would take it. When kids would make fun of us, Em and Heather would cry, so I would take it. I didn't care, and nothing could hurt me, at least as the image I wanted to project. We were explorers as kids. We loved to go out on little adventures and find all the weird places out in the middle of nowhere. Our parents let us. Like I said, it was old school. Just be home in time for dinner, etc. It also helps that we often lied about how far we would go. The explorer phase didn't last terribly long, however. Just a few years, until we were about 12. I wanted it to last longer, but we had to put an end to it one day. That day is where our story begins. It's too far, lull. It would be dark before we even got there. Him said. I have to be back for my chores before sundown. Heather added. Stop being pussies, guys. I got it all worked out. Stacy's brother can give us a ride to Lightbody Ranch. From there it's an hour's walk tops. I assured them with utmost confidence. My dad would not be happy if he found out I went up there, or that I got in a car with a stranger. Em combated. Your dad is never happy. What's this about you sucking off strangers in cars? Yelled a familiar voice from behind us. The boy who thought he was so clever was named Mitch Fraser, the only kid in 6th grade more full-mouthed than me and a true tyrant. I expect that from street trash, but not from you, Emily. Mitch added as he approached, flanked by his little posse of Dale and Bennett. Fuck off, Mitch. These words were pre-programmed in me by now. I'm not talking to you, trash. I'm trying to have a conversation with Emily. Gross. I muttered. Gross. I'm not the one sucking dicks in cars. But that's what you get when you hang out with emo skanks like Leela Kelly. Don't talk about her like that. Heather shouted. I kept telling them not to get angry, not to yell or cry. I knew even back then that would just encourage them. But they couldn't help it, bless their hearts. Hey, the lesbo can talk, Dale added. I guarantee he had no idea what that word meant. He just liked to parrot everything Mitch said. Also jokes on him that turned out to be me. Heather went silent, as did Em. I just stood there seething with rage. I wanted to punch him in his stupid fat face, but I've been down that road before. Well, it was awesome. It didn't end well. All right, guys, all right. Let's leave them to it. Clearly, they have BIG plans. Where are you losers off to this time anyway? Mitch asked with a palpable smugness. Like I tell you, go jerk each other off. I responded. Admittedly, I also didn't know what that meant. Maybe this will be the time Black-Eyed Susan gets them. Dale piped up again. Mitch's eyes lit up. Yeah, you know my brother told me. He said he doesn't just kill you. He said he holds you hostage and feeds you to his plants. I shook my head. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How do you feed someone to plants? Plants don't eat. He waters his plants with your blood, and then when he's done with you, he turns you into fertilizer, but still alive. He explained, really trying to add creepiness to his voice. You're making that up, Aim yelled. She frightened easily. Despite how many times I told her it was all bullshit, she would still get shaken by these tales, and these kids knew it. Tell your brother to be more creative next time, dipshit. I shouted. Fuck you. I hope you enjoy being plant food. Mitch and his pals walked away laughing. He really did seem proud of that exit line. It's not true. They're dumb, Eam said, clearly seeking reassurance. Of course not. Stop worrying about what those idiots say, all right? They just want to scare us. That guy died a long time ago anyway, so it doesn't matter. Now focus up. Let's get through last period, then we'll go see Stacy's brother and do this thing. The bell rang and we went inside. 2 more long, boring hours later, and we were our way. Stacy's brother Dom was 16, had a license, and was always trying to hang out with us for some reason. He did occasionally have his uses, like today. He drove us in his dad's old pickup over to Light Buddy Ranch and agreed to pick us back up at 8th. From there, we headed north. I don't know about that guy, Heather said. Who, Dom? He's all right, I think. I replied with that childlike naivety. But if he's weird, we'll just kill him. Can we not talk about killing so much right now? Em interjected. Why are we even going to this place? It's so creepy. Hither found it to ask her. I just said it looked cool. I didn't say I wanted to go there. Heather explained. It does look cool. A place that's always foggy, that's awesome. We had to come see it, I said, attempting to raise the excitement level. But what about killers? Em asked. Why would there be a killer out in the middle of nowhere in the fog? There's no one to even kill, and you wouldn't be able to see who you're killing. Think about it, I said with the soundest logic. Our walk went on, and the fog came into view, an endless wall of it, concealing the faint shadowy spires of dozens of trees. A gorgeous, eerie sight. Em got more and more nervous as we approached, but Heather began to match my excitement. Fool, this looks so cool, Heather said. That's insane. How is there that much fog? I added. My dad said something about a cold current meeting a warm stream. Heather explained. I don't know what that means. It's beautiful, Heather said, ignoring my stupidity. Let's go. Oh God. Em lamented. I'll hold your hand, Em, I offered. Em gave me an exaggerated death glare and silently extended her hand. I took it and the 3 of us walked inside. It was stunning. The desaturated grays that hung like a veil over the trees created an ethereal effect that somehow perfectly complemented the bright autumn colors of the dead leaves, littering the ground. It was like something both enchanted and haunted. Okay, guys, it's really hard to see in here. Let's not go in any further. Let's just stay here, Em said, being the voice of reason. Yeah, you're right, Em. I don't want to get lost. Heather agreed. I let out an audible groan. Fine. Good idea. So we sat in a circle, our backs to trees, just taking the sights. Em eventually mellowed out and agreed it was beautiful in here. The sun began to set, which only made it more gorgeous. I'd love to just disappear in here, you know, Heather said, sounding deep in thought. What do you mean by that? I asked, genuinely puzzled. Just, I don't know. Get away from it all. Nobody would ever bother us. Nobody would even find us. We could just live. That sounds like it would get boring, though, I responded. I get that, Heather, Aim answered. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I really did try to understand the appeal of what Heather said, but I wasn't there yet. The sun set quickly, and the rich, deep blues of the night sky added another layer of beauty to the forest. Unfortunately, it was almost time to go. Heather and I lamented that fact, but Em was ready to get out of there. She was the first to stand up, but as she did, she let out a small shriek. I jumped and looked over to see her staring off into the fog. "What is it, Em?" Em responded in a hushed and shaky voice, not a vert in her eyes. "Who is that?" A shiver crept up my spine. No one was supposed to be here. I looked where Em was looking. Initially, I couldn't see anything, but my eyes began to adjust. There was a faint silhouette of a figure lurking amongst the trees and the blue-gray haze. A long ways away. If it were any further, we wouldn't be able to see it at all. It was a human-shaped figure only. It wasn't moving, and its arms were outstretched to either side, completely horizontal. It almost looked to me like someone mocking the crucifixion. But it couldn't be a person. It just didn't make sense. "I think that's just a tree or something," I said, squinting into the dark. "It looks like a person," Heather added. "Yeah," Em agreed. Both of their voices were so shaky now, but I was skeptical. "No, guys, that can't be a person. They're not moving. Their arms are out all weird. Why would someone just stand there like that? It's just a trick of the shadows," I rationalized, not entirely confident in my words. The longer we stared, the more its lack of movement unnerved me, but also the more it confirmed in my eyes that it couldn't be a real person. "Maybe it's a statue." Heather posited. "I'm going to go look," I said. "What?" Aim exclaimed, trying very hard to remain as quiet as possible. "No, what's wrong with you?" Heather said, bewildered. "Guys, chill. It's not a person, and I'm not going to go right up to it. I'm just going to walk a few steps forward until I can make out what it is. Just a few feet. Let's just go." Aim pleaded. "Don't be stupid," Heather added, not mincing words. "Just a few feet. Nothing's going to happen. You guys are so dramatic." I began to walk ahead despite their objections. I was scared, but confident enough by this point. The figure grew in my vision as I got closer. The gray of its silhouette got darker and darker. Its features began to clarify. Definitely human-shaped, but its head was misshapen. Not a statue, as it was clearly wearing clothes of some kind, but they were unusually loose and baggy. I ended up walking a few steps further than I intended. I heard Heather and Em quietly shouting for me to come back, but I had to know. I could make out vague details now. A few steps further, and I could finally see the misshapen head was actually a burlap sack, and it looked like there might have been some kind of smiley face on it. It's a fucking scarecrow," I shouted. "Really?" asked Em, a palpable relief in her voice. "Yep, just a scarecrow," I said, laughing as I turned around and walked back to my friends. "I told you guys it wasn't a person. Why is there a scarecrow in the middle of a forest?" Heather questioned. "Who knows? That was funny, though." "No, it wasn't." "Can we go now?" Aim again pleaded. I let out another chuckle and nodded. We were about ready to leave, but then, from just a few feet away in the opposite direction of the scarecrow, little flowers. A deep, male voice softly called out to us. We all shot to attention, all of us too shocked to scream. "What was that?" Em whispered. We all looked around frantically in every direction. Nothing. We couldn't see anything past the fog and the deep blue darkness. I couldn't see the scarecrow anymore either. Why couldn't I see it anymore? I reached out, grabbing Em and Heather's shoulders and pulling them towards me. They grabbed onto me in return. What the fuck? What the fuck? I whispered. "We have to go." Now Heather commanded, matching our attempted whispers. "Which way did we come in?" Em asked. "That way," Heather said, pointing to her left. Before we started making a run for it, we heard the distinct sound of a twig snapping dangerously close to us. This time we did scream, and we ran. Fortunately, Heather was right, and we ran out of that place fast, past the trees and past the fog into the plain open field. But we did not stop running until we reached Lightbody Ranch. We collapsed in a heap when we finally got close enough to safety, all of us in tears. "I'm never doing anything like that again, Lila. Never again," Em snapped. I had never seen her like this before. "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry, guys." I don't know what that was. I shouted through heavy breaths. Heather didn't say a word. She just cried. We didn't tell anybody about that night, but we agreed to stop exploring. The next few days were a little tense. I felt awful about making them go up there with me. They forgave me, because they're the best, but I didn't forgive myself. What I saw and what I heard replayed over and over in my mind for several nights. I can only imagine it did the same for them too. After a while, though, we were able to laugh about it in our own ways. The fear lingered beneath the surface, but we felt safe enough in our town in the daylight. I noticed small changes in my friends ever since that day. Em got a little more skittish, and she didn't want to go outside as much. Heather did the opposite. I think a part of her enjoyed the adrenaline. As for me, I think I was a bit less of a brat after that. I stopped pressuring them into doing the stupid shit I wanted to do. I didn't want to be that person anymore. As more years passed, more things changed in us, as things do. Boys began to be part of our lives. Well, their lives, and my life by proxy. Em got herself a boyfriend at 15, practically an arranged marriage by her dad. Didn't go far, but it was a good excuse for Dad to get his precious daughter away from her lower-class heathen friends as much as possible. Heather was a different story. That Dom guy stayed in our lives, much to our annoyance at first. But then he and Heather got close. Heather was 16 now, and we were all going through the madness of that age in our own ways. She didn't get any attention from boys growing up, since they would all call her, so when this cute older guy started working his charm on her at that vulnerable age, it worked. Em and I tried to act supportive as her friends, but even as young and stupid as we were, we knew it wasn't right. It was too fast, he was too old and too much, and we were worried. When Em and I began to bring up our concerns over this new relationship is when tension began. She didn't want to hear it, and he began feeling threatened. She saw more of him and less of us. Less of everyone, actually. At some point, she began staying with him full time. God knows what he was filling her head with, because every time we did see her, she was less and less of the girl we knew. She would blow up at us. She would be vile towards us. This went on for 8 months, and we all tried to get her back, but everything we did pushed her closer to him. So many nights ended in heartatch. Eventually, it all blew up. He took something a little too far, and enough was enough. She got out. And Em was right there when she did. But I should have been, and it is the greatest regret of my life that I didn't just go over there and hug her and tell her I loved her. I just couldn't. I was still mad. Not mad at her, just mad at everything. I looked at Heather, and all I could see were the countless nights of Em crying in my arms. We all tried to be friends again. On the surface, it seemed like we were, but it wasn't the same. We were damaged. Em was the only one really trying to keep us together. I wanted to try for her, but I was too disconnected. The next few weeks we drifted further and further apart. I will always remember the morning April 27, 2015. Em called me out of the blue at TAM while I was skipping school. Her voice was shaking and frantic, and she was yelling, "They can't find Heather. Heather's gone. Heather's gone." Over and over. Dom was the prime suspect in the eyes of police, and certainly in the eyes of me. But there was no evidence of any foul play whatsoever, in fact. So people started saying she did it herself, she just ran away. I eventually accepted that. As much as it hurt, it unfortunately made sense. She was always one to isolate when things were bad. She went through so much. She may have felt like she didn't have anyone, and that was my fault. I let her down. The thought tore me apart. Never accepted it. She refused to believe that Heather would just run away. So we continued to search, even after everyone else stopped. If I didn't go with them, she would have gone out on her own, and I couldn't bear the thought of that. We set out to turn every stone in the valley, much against our family's wishes. I never had a problem disobeying, but to see Em so vehemently and directly oppose her parents' orders scared the crap out of me. We began our searches, tying ribbons to trees to mark our location when we got far out into the wilderness. Those first few days it would be me who would cry, not Em. The guilt bore a hole in me, but Em was my rock. That was the thing about Em. She was a very delicate girl. She cried a lot, but the second someone else needed her to be strong, she was iron. She always had a way of comforting people too, especially me. Once our parents accepted that we wouldn't stop searching, they were at least able to persuade us to be back home by nightfall, and to not go into the areas without cell reception. One night we disobeyed both of those requests. Somewhere in the northern section, beyond Lightbody Ranch, amidst the hills and the prairies, was a forest that was always foggy. We always had it in the back of our minds that maybe she went back there. We were told that the area was searched already, but if she didn't want to be found, it would be easy not to be. So, we had to go there. We had to go back. By the time we arrived, it was already late in the afternoon and the sun began to descend. The wall of fog came into view once again, and M went forth without hesitation. Even though I'd been there before, I underestimated how dense the fog would be. It felt different this time. Different time of year. Maybe that was it. Em and I had to hold hands as we trudged through it, afraid we would disappear if we strayed more than a few feet away from each other. We tied a lot of ribbons as we went along. The further we walked, the more the ground began to sink and squelch beneath our feet. I didn't remember it being like this before, though we didn't get this far in last time. Our feet quickly got soaked and covered in mud and moss. We had to lift our legs higher and higher as we stepped. It didn't take long to realize we were wading into a bog. I told Em we had to leave, that it was too dangerous to be out here. Em got the idea in her head that this is what happened to Heather, that she ran out here and got stuck in the bog. Em was even more determined now to keep searching, but I screamed at her to stop.
Look around. We shouldn't be here. We're not prepared for this. Please, let's just go back. No.
Leela, I can't leave her out here like this. What if she's alive? What if she needs our help? I know, but we don't know what the fuck we're doing. We could get lost. We could sink. We could die out here. Heather wouldn't want this. Let's just go back. Let's get equipment and bring some more people. We can do this properly. Lola, please. Please listen to me. I can't lose you too, okay? Without another word, Em lowered her head and nodded. We turned around and started heading back the way we came. At least I thought we did. Things were unfamiliar as we walked. We couldn't find the ribbons we tied on the way in. The fog only seemed to get denser, as did the vegetation. Fear and desperation were looming and creeping in slowly as time continued to pass without progress being made. The irrational part of my mind went back to Black-Eyed Susan, the killer in the wilderness who takes young girls. I knew Black-Eyed Susan was long dead, but it didn't stop the fear. Then my mind went to the scarecrow. Someone put it there all those years ago. But who and why? This just felt like a place we shouldn't be. I could read the same feeling on Em's face. The flora was rich and bountiful now. If everything wasn't so hazy and gray, this place might look almost enchanted. Everything here was allowed to grow and die and grow again unbothered. What began as a scent of dead water slowly gave way to a floral fragrance, like a grandmother's perfume, but way too much of it. It didn't replace the smell of the dead water, it merely sat on top of it, creating a layered smell of flowers and death. It was nauseating. My head began throbbing. We carried on, moving as straight as possible. It had to end somewhere, but we were getting tired and the sun was getting low. It wasn't just physical fatigue, but mental too. My head continued to throb and I began seeing spots. My tired eyes began to make shapes out of the fog. I started thinking I was seeing things, figures, exactly like the scarecrow, standing on the edge of perception, staring at us. But they would be gone just as quick as they arrived. I tried to ignore it. Just my mind filling in the blanks with the memories of my dread. The knots on the trees played tricks on me too, almost looking like faces until I got close. It got quieter as night fell, much quieter. It began to look and feel like death, like we were ferrying ourselves to the underworld, even though the trees and flowers remained vital and healthy. In fact, it was odd how beautiful they looked. The picturesque flowers contrasted with the muddy, mossy, slummy mulch and the stark desaturation of the fog. We were getting really scared now. The bog didn't seem to want to end. Em complained about her toes going numb, and I didn't even notice that mine did too. The wet ground was so cold now, and our feet were completely waterlogged. That pins and needles sensation crept up from my toes to my ankles. The figures didn't stop appearing. Arms always outstretched, looking like little fuzzy crucifixes. It got harder and harder to pretend they were a trick of the eyes. I wondered if Em could see them too. One quick glance over to her, and the expression on her face told me she could. But it didn't make sense. Why would there be scarecrows in a bog? Why this many? Why were they always so far away? I would have thought we'd approach one at some point. Move past one. Even get remotely close to one, but they were always the same distance, always on the edge of perception, no matter where we were. They would have to be moving, but I never saw them move. I shook the thought from my head. I was just scaring myself. It had to be my imagination. It had to be. I couldn't let myself go down this road. I had to focus on the task at hand. I had to focus on the reality of the situation. I took a wrong step and my entire right leg sank into the dense, muddy quicksand. I screamed, and I heard that scream echo through the trees. Normally, I don't think I would have screamed, but the sensation disturbed me. It didn't feel like my leg sank. It felt like it was pulled, like a hand clasped around it and violently yanked me down. But I dismissed it quickly. It only felt like that because of how quickly I sank and how dense the mud was. My mind was playing more tricks on me. There was no other explanation. Em pulled me out, and we carried on. Eventually, the ground got more solid beneath our feet. It was a huge relief. Finally, it felt like we made progress, and we could rest our legs a little bit. Em collapsed on the solid grass, and I followed. She began to laugh, a shaky, uneasy laugh that I had never heard from her before, somewhere between a laugh and a cry. She was so scared it was the only response her body gave her. I instinctively pulled her into an embrace, as much for my benefit as hers. Her fingers dug into my back, refusing to let me go, and we stayed like that for a while. "I'm sorry," she said shakily, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry I made you come here. I totally fucked us." I was taken aback. I had never heard her swear before. I offered her as much reassurance as I could, but I was soon distracted by what I saw in the trees. I wanted to see our ribbons. Instead, I saw symbols carved into the wood. The most common one being an inverted triangle with a line through the bottom. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but it scared the hell out of me nonetheless. This didn't look like a place that any human had touched. We were so much further inside than last time, and yet clearly someone had been here. Maybe it was Black-Eyed Susan, I thought. Maybe this was where he hid all those years ago. Look at all this, I told Em while pointing at the trees, but when I looked back at her, she was standing and her eyes were as big as saucers. Her gaze was fixed upon something else. I turned my eyes to face whatever she was looking at, but I didn't see anything. Just a big hawthorn tree off in the distance in a clearing, partially obscured by the fog. "What is it?" I asked, trying to see what had her so transfixed. "Do you see it?" she said, her voice shakier than I've ever heard before. "Do I see what? Where?" "In the tree. There's something." Her voice shrank to a whisper and she repeated her words. "There's something." I looked back at the tree. I looked at the leaves, the branches, the trunk. I looked over it again and again. All I saw was a tree. We're in the tree. "What does it look like?" I asked, trying desperately to understand, though a part of me was afraid of the answer. "It's not I in the tree, I asked the tree. Something's wrong with it." Em responded, not really clearing anything up for me. I squinted and looked as hard as I could. Em was right. There was something a bit off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It looked perfectly normal, but there was just something uncanny about it. Were we just going insane? I guess it does look a little, I don't know, I said, unable to describe my thoughts. Then I shrugged and turned back to Em. Em slowly turned to look at me, but as she did, I saw her eyes shift and look behind my right shoulder. Then they widened. She gasped. I saw a look of horror on her face, the level of which I had never seen on anyone before. I didn't have a chance to look behind me. Em grabbed my hand and exploded into a full sprint away from the tree and through a small gap in the flora. My legs fumbled and I struggled to keep up, but she practically dragged me. Her grip on my hand was tight and unrelenting. Branches and twigs scratched and scraped my skin to ribbons, but I couldn't feel it. We ran for what felt like miles. My legs screamed in pain and my chest heaved, but the adrenaline carried us both. "What was it?" I yelled over and over, but she didn't answer. She just kept running. We reached the sinking area of the bog again, but Em didn't care. She trudged through like the devil itself were on our tail, and I followed as best as I could. I got the chance to look behind me, but I saw nothing. Then it happened. I got stuck. My leg went down awkwardly, and my other leg sank behind it into the freezing cold muck. I felt the hand sensation on my legs again, but then a sharp, cold, stabbing pain. It felt like frostbite, but also something close to an actual bite. Em immediately wrapped her arms around me and pulled, screaming as she gave it everything she had. She didn't get far, only succeeding in squeezing the remaining air out of my lungs. She tried again and again. Between each attempt, she looked behind me with unknowable fear and panic etched all over her face. She expected to see something. I heard a twig break in the distance, so distinctly similar to the sound that sent us running years ago. Em panicked even more than she already was. She reached her hands into the muck, hoping to pull me up from underneath somehow. I saw her expression change to one of confusion. She began to pull, but not on me. She found something else, something solid. As she moved it, I could feel it wrapped around me like vines or tentacles. She pulled, and then I heard a snap. Em fell backwards and some of the tension around me released. I felt a current under the mud where the snap was, like a small hose lightly spraying underwater. It helped dislodge me, whatever it was. A few bubbles formed at the top. I didn't care to investigate. I simply pulled myself out with Em's help, and we stumbled back into a run. The bog thankfully came to an end, and it was a forest once again. I saw in the distance, our saving grace, one of our ribbons. Then another. We followed them, and just like that, we were out. We reached the end of the fog, the end of our nightmare. Way off in the distance, down the hill, we saw Lightbody Ranch. Past that, the faint, comforting glimmer of the lights of civilization. Her parents were furious looking at the state of us when we hobbled back well after nightfall. They put their foot down, no more searches. We didn't object. Em never really told me what she saw, whether at the tree or behind me. She said she didn't know, then guessed that it must have been an animal. I wonder who she was trying to convince. I looked up the symbols I saw in the trees. It appeared to be the alchemic symbol for Earth, which didn't answer a whole lot. We were both worn out by this nightmarish night, but also by the entirety of the last few months. It was hard to see Em give up. She never gave up on anything or anyone, but after so long of not finding a single lead, and then potentially almost dying, it was time to call it quits. So that's where we left it. All we could do now was pick up the pieces and try to carry on. Slowly but surely we did. The next year, Em graduated high school with honors and got herself into a fancy university on the other side of the country. I didn't have a hope in hell of getting in there too, so that was it. I didn't want to lose her, but what could I do? No way was I going to let her not take that opportunity. We said our goodbyes, and then she was gone. I made sure to save my tears for later, and there were a lot of them. I did tell her I loved her before she went, the way I wish I could have told Heather. As those words left my mouth for the last time, I knew she would never fully realize how much they meant. I wished that at some point I got the chance to tell her how much. But she was gone now, and I was on my own. I'd like to say Em, and I kept in touch. We did for a little while, but it fizzled out quickly. We weren't made to interact like that, text, behind a screen. That wasn't us. It felt almost disrespectful to our friendship to reduce it to that. We agreed we would rather just meet back up someday and catch up on everything we missed. But time flew by and, for one reason or another, that didn't happen. We had our own lives. It was just too hard to make it work. So that was it for Em and I. That was it for the Hell Sisters. I found my way into city life not long after Em left. Got a job. Figured it out, got a culinary degree of all things. The first year or so was rough. I would lie awake at night thinking about the bog, about Heather, about that weird tree, but through therapy and melatonin it passed. The next few years were easier. Now that I was in the city, dating was a lot more feasible for me. It's not like my preferences were a huge secret back in Willow Bay, but it was a little hushed. If I was to get around Em's father, for example, I feel like he might have burned me at the stake or something. Nevertheless, I was getting laid now, and that helped tremendously. It's hard to believe that 9 years passed since the night at the bog. It was a distant, traumatic memory. A crazy little story to tell friends. A classic spooky time I almost died tale. I thought that was all it was ever going to be. I thought my time in Willow Bay was over. I thought I would never really get answers. I definitely never thought that I would hear the name Black-Eyed Susan again. But then I got a phone call. I looked at my phone. It was Em. I don't think I'd spoken to her in 2 years by this point, but there she was. A wave of surprise and mild anxiety rushed through me, but I answered immediately. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, lamented how long it had been, apologies all around for being busy, but I could sense there was a greater motive to this call, and M confirmed my suspicion. So I was wondering, or I wanted to ask something. She said with a bit of hesitation. Yeah, what's up? I need you to go on a trip with me. Leela. Oh, I was completely taken aback. Yeah, I am going back home, and I really want you to come with me. You're going home. Yeah. To Willow Bay, it wouldn't be long, just a few days. I can pay for everything and look. It's a long story. I'll tell you everything. Just say yes. I'll come get you. We can finally catch up like we keep saying we will. I just need you with me because no one else would understand. Please lie. She sounded casual, but her voice betrayed melancholy and slight desperation. I could tell she really wanted me to say yes. Are you okay, Em? Did something happen? I'm okay. I'll tell you everything on the road, I promise. I just need to do this. I need to do it now, and I really want you with me. I know, it's sudden and you don't have to. I'm in. Let's do it. I cut her off. Sure, I could have prodded for more information. I could have sweated the details. But despite all the time and the lost contact, this was my best friend and she said she needed me. There was never any doubt what my answer would be. I packed a small suitcase, called off work, and waited for him to pick me up the next morning. She really wasn't kidding about it being a sudden thing. She arrived in an absolutely tiny little dark blue bug. It was nice and modern looking, way better than my piece of shit, but it was dainty as hell, and I questioned how it was going to handle a cross-country trip. She got out of the car to greet me, and seeing her in person after all these years was wild. So familiar but so different. It looked like she was cosplaying a grown-up. She was dressed smart, as the hicks in our town would say, even though it wasn't anything crazy. Really just a nice pastel cardigan and necklace, but she looked good, as beautiful as ever. I was instantly proud of her for how put together she appeared, though I had no doubts. I also clocked the same friendship bracelet on her wrist, or at least one that looked like the same one that we had as kids. I couldn't help but smile. She smiled and hugged me right away. I'm so glad you can come. Oh, of course. You look so good, by the way. What the fuck? Why you look so good? She combated, smiling and gesturing towards me with shock on her face. Oh no, come on. I'll always look like a hobo. No, you look A-M-A-Z-I-N-G. I bet you get lots of, pussy. Em laughed and her face went red. I was going to say girls. Oh my God, you still don't swear, do you? I have before. I dare you to say pussy once. I'm not going to do that. No, Bob. Come on, one time. No. Now get in the after freaking car. I put my bag in the trunk and we hit the road. I was worried if things wouldn't feel the same after so long, but we fell into our old rhythm immediately. I didn't even realize how much I missed this. We alternated our playlists every few hours. For as much as she liked to keep it clean, all the music she listened to was wildly aggressive. Total filth, mostly about sucking dick or fucking. Music was always her one way of rebelling. My playlist, on the other hand, Madonna, Pat Benatar, Bonnie Tyler, Cyndi Lauper, 80s pop rock, and love ballads. Can't get enough of them. I don't know what that says about me. For those first couple hours, it was everything I ever wanted. We caught up. We talked about our lives. Em was doing very well for herself. She had a nice cushy job now, lots of friends. It was so great to see her flourishing. But in a pocket of silence, I had to ask, so Em, what are we doing? What is this trip? Em's smile faded and she took in a big, basically, we're going to see my dad. Your dad. You know he hates me, right? Yeah, I know. He hasn't been thrilled with me either these past few years, but I got a call from him the other day. He sounded bad, confused. I just need to go see if he's okay. Oh. Okay. Well, I hope he's all right, but why did you want me to come then? I'm not complaining, but I just don't think I would be of much help. I feel like I would make things worse. Well, it's one of the things he said. What did he say? He said he saw Heather. My blood ran cold. Surely these were just the delusions of a man advancing in age, but him never did give up on Heather. If there was even the slightest chance that she really came back. That's why she brought me. How much do you know about Black-Eyed Susan? Im asked. That serial killer. Yeah, I looked him up a little bit after we got lost in that bog. He killed like 6 girls back in the 90s and early 2000s, right? Did a bunch of gnarly shit to them. Strung them up in trees and cut out their eyes or something. I responded. I was unnerved by her question. I couldn't understand how this could be related. Yeah, I looked him up too. It's hard to find a lot of information about him and what he did why. I'm not sure. No, I mean, why did you bring him up? Oh, my dad, he mentioned him too. I got chills again. It was strange. Why would he mention a serial killer from 20 years ago? Was his mind really that far gone? I also wondered what Em meant when she said that her dad hadn't been too thrilled with her either. I decided to break all this seriousness in the air. I see that friendship bracelet, by the way. Is that the same damn one from decades ago? Oh, chuckled. Yeah, I fished it out of an old box. Felt appropriate? No shit. I wish I brought mine. I think it's gone, though. Oh no, that sucks. Yeah, I moved around a lot. I think like 90% of my old stuff has gone somewhere. Also, I decided I hate you. So, sure. I get that I didn't expect you to keep it this long, honestly. Yeah, why not's rude. I can keep things. Em shot me a sarcastic look. Come on. You and Heather went through those bracelets like tissues. That one summer I had to make like 20 of them for you guys. Meanwhile, I never broke mine once. So basically, I'm the better friend, is what I'm saying. The boring friend, we couldn't help it. We were getting into scrapes. We got our hands dirty. We handled business, da. Handled business. Im mocked. I am naughty boring. Well, hey, I don't know how you are now. I don't know what kind of crazy slut phase you went through when you got to the big city. But as a kid, bit lame, gotta say. Im laughed and shook her head in dismay. Hey, I did stuff. I wasn't lame. I let you drag me into all kinds of nonsense. I don't know anything about a slut phase, though. No, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You were so sheltered your whole life. It was so sad and adorable. You can't tell me you didn't get to the city and just have a parade of debauchery. Well, I've had sex, if that's what you're asking, but I didn't have a parade about it. You should have. I would have been there singing songs. Keep the Christian vibe, give you some hallelujah. Im laughed. You are a complete nightmare. Miles passed, dozens of songs played. Civilization faded as we drove further and further out. Conversation ebbed and flowed between silliness and sincerity, the same way it always did when we were together. Em told me all the gossip about the old town. She kept in touch with her family there far more than I ever did. I didn't even know if my family was still alive. Any remnants of a city were replaced by long patches of scenic, nothing broken up by small podunk towns and gas stations. Day turned to night and we stopped at a cheap motel to get some shut-eye. We made do on opposite ends of one queen bed. I couldn't complain, it was far softer than my bed. In fact, it was the best sleep I got in a long time, but by sunup we hit the road again. After a few more hours in the great wide absence, I started to remember the looks of these trees and the curves of these hills. The expansive rectangular patches of distinct colors spread far and wide across the plains denoting crops and farmland of all kinds. Old busted-up barns and silos peppered the area, as did lengths of makeshift wooden and wire fencing. This was home. Welcome to Willow Bay, read the sign in familiar cursive. Memories couldn't help but flood back. I started absent, minutely counting all the buildings I remembered getting high behind. The town looked the same, only a little more weathered and overgrown. I couldn't tell if it was the 8 years breaking the place down, or just my memory glossing it all up. It looked grayer too, though that could have just been the sky. Deeply overcast and moderately foggy. A subtle effect, but it made this place have the air of a ghost town. Like the town itself was a memory slowly fading. We got lunch at the old diner. We had been here 1,000 times, the three of us. So many good memories that even the grayest sky couldn't dampen. Finally being outside the car, standing on the ground. Breathing in the old air was a trip. I forgot how different this air was over here. I don't remember it smelling so floral. That felt new. Or maybe it was always like this, and I was just used to it. We sat at the same old table as we used to. I ordered the eggs Benedict hash with extra hollandaise and Em chuckled. You got that every time. Every time. Even the extra hollandaise. Yeah, well, it's the thing to get. It always looked so gross to me. That's how you know it's good food. The more fucked up it looks, the better it tastes. That's just a fact. Heather would agree with me. Yeah, right, I'll ask her when we see her. Em replied in a joking manner. I could see in her eyes, though, that glimmer of hope. We ate our food and headed back out. It was time to see the old man. Em seemed visibly despondent as we got closer, undoubtedly full of worry about the mental state of her father. We pulled up to her old family home. Even it wasn't immune to the creeping decay of time, as the paint chipped and cracked, and the lawn appeared overgrown. Em hesitated before knocking on the door. I took a few steps forward so that we would be side by side instead of her being out in front. That seemed to make her feel at least a little better. Feet shuffled on the other side and the door opened. Her dad didn't look anything like how I remembered. Sure, his face was the same, but his demeanor was completely foreign to me. He used to have so much presence. He wasn't a strong man per se, but he carried himself with such stoic self-importance and clean, cut superiority. He stood straight and proper, chin held high like a soldier. Now though, this man before me was small and frail, hunched over. His hair was shaggy and unkempt. He hadn't shaved in days, which, for him, was a lot. He was wearing some silk pajamas, which looked very cozy and upper class, but the old Ted I knew wouldn't be seen dead in anything other than a sweater vest or priest robes. Emily, oh my goodness, what are you doing here? I told you didn't have to come, the old man said in a weak but elated voice. Hey, Dad. I am greeted with a smile and a hug. Hey, Miss Sir. Nope, I added, not expecting my own greeting. Come in, girls, come in. His feet shuffled as he led us inside to the living room. He and Em exchanged small talk as he put on the tea. To give him credit, he did ask if I wanted some. We sat comfortably on the couch and waited for him to return to his old recliner. As he sat down, his jovial demeanor lessened a bit, and I could tell the small talk was ending. I'm sorry if my phone call scared you. I just got a little confused is all. But it's so good to see you. And you too, Lila. I smiled in response. I held a lot of resentment towards this man for a lot of years. All the constant backhanded comments and the judgment and the controlling babe behavior had made him up to be some big villain in my life. But now all I saw was an old man excited to see his daughter again. I don't know if I can forgive him for the way he always made me feel about myself, but in this moment, I was able to let go of a lot of the anger. How long were you planning on staying? He asked. Oh, a few days maybe, Em responded. Mr. Noby sounded disappointed, but his next words confused and unsettled me. No, you should probably leave sooner. What? Why? The old man stammered. It would be better. Why would it be better? The old man struggled to find the words, so he just shook his head and moved on. I still pray for you both, and for Heather. Yeah, I know, Dad. It's terrible, it's just terrible what happened. I thought he wasn't, I thought God would. He trailed off, but Em caught the same thing I did. She questioned. I don't know. The old man was clearly rattled by his slip-up. You're talking about black-eyed Susan. No, I don't want to. Do you know something about what happened to Heather? Em prodded with increasing authority in her voice. Emily, her dad uttered, attempting to scold, but he was clearly on the back foot. I had never seen him shaken like this before. It scared me to death. Please, Dad, if you know something, or if you really did see her like you said you did, you have to tell us. You, Chavi, to call you. It was wrong to cause things. You say those shouldn't have come. I'm sorry. I can't. I shouldn't. So why did you call me? What happened? Em now raised her voice with an undercurrent of frustration. I was just scared. Scared of what? Em yelled. The old man fell silent and averted his gaze, as did Em. She sat back and sank in the couch, collecting herself. I could see deep and painful emotion bubbling beneath her blank expression, but I also saw calculation. She was meticulously putting together the words she wanted to say next. If you think you're protecting me, you're not. If you think I'm still a Nanavi little girl, I'm not. I'm not a child. My best friend has been missing for 9 years, Dad. Whatever you tell me, it isn't going to be any worse than what my mind has already thought of. The old man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his legs, before he solemnly uttered, "Wes it is." A chill ran down my spine. It felt like the air in the room got sucked out. M was visibly shaken by his response. The old man let out a sigh. "You really want to hear this?" "Yes, please," M responded meekly. "Okay, Emily, okay, you do deserve to know. I do want you to know. Just tell me if you want me to stop or if you need a minute. I want to know everything." He nodded and sat back in his chair in deep contemplation before finally speaking. "I took an oath to never repeat these things. It was my duty. Under no circumstance could I breathe a word of what anyone confessed to me, and I never did. I didn't think that I would need to, either. But," he paused, took a long sip of his drink, and collected himself. Em and I waited patiently for him to continue. 2003 or 4, maybe. You're around 6 at this time. I'm running confession. This man comes into the booth. He says, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The whole thing. Then he sits there quiet for about 3 minutes. Sometimes this happens. I give him the time to gather his wits. Then he says I am the one they call Black-Eyed Susan. Mr. Noby cleared his throat and fidgeted with his fingers. He squirmed in his seat. I've never seen a man so uncomfortable. Not only was he reliving a traumatic moment, he was betraying a lifelong oath at the same time. The man I knew was a steel trap, stubborn and sturdy as an old oak. No amount of words or passionate pleas would move him. What changed? The paper said there were 6 murders, but he told me there were so many more. Dozens. He told me what he did to them, and I thought he was lying at first. Sometimes you get pranksters. But the more he went on, I knew he was the guy. He said he came here because he needed to be cleansed. He needed to be pure before the next step. That's a word he kept using, pure. All the girls he took had to be in his eyes. That's why they were. As that last sentence struggled to leave his mouth, his lip quivered and his voice broke. He shook his head and set his jaw. My skin crawled. It wasn't about murder. It wasn't about pleasure. Either he was obsessed with this idea that he could find life's deepest secrets. Only through purity. Only through being one with the earth and with nature. He said plants, trees, and flowers can sense the cosmic rhythm of the universe, as he called it, that they move with the sun and the constellations. He saw them as the purest essence of life, and so they must hold the secret to it. He wanted to see what they see, feel what they feel, attune himself to that cosmic rhythm, learn and ascend. It all sounded insane, but if you could hear his voice when he said it, he believed every word. He was right, it did sound insane. Em had a sick look on her face, but she was listening intently. I was beginning to regret hearing about this. The old man continued. He used those girls to do it. His little flowers. He called them. Another shiver went up my spine. I remembered those words. He said it had to be girls because something about motherhood and Mother Nature. They could create life. So they had the capacity to understand life. So he would take them and try and force them to somehow bond with the plants. To hybridize, to become one with them. He had many methods. Psychological, surgical, physically grafting plant life onto them, into them. When they would die, he would take the parts he needed and discard the rest into the earth. I almost retched. "Monsieur." Noby steeled his jaw once again. Of course, it didn't work, nothing would happen. But then he looked into one of his victims, eyes as they were about to die, and he said he saw it. Whatever it was he was looking for. Life, the universe, eternity. He said it was right there in her eyes. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. So he took them. Then he started taking all of their eyes. He'd preserve them and look at them, and he would see. He would learn. Mr. Noby began to sound less like a man merely relaying the ramblings of an unstable man, and more like an unstable man himself. There was a fanatical tone underlying in the cadence of his words. Slowly creeped in the surface the more he spoke. I don't think he was aware of it. This felt like a new man to the one we had spoken to even 5 minutes ago. Then his experiments started to work. He said it all began making sense to him. He made serums, drug cocktails, stabilizers. He took their brain tissue and tried to wire it into the plant roots. He fed them blood, used skin and muscle as soil. He put veins and tendons into the vines and hearts to pump the blood through. Everything he could use. Everything he could graft and bind and connect to make them one. Any way to hybridize, whether it worked or not. He said he wanted to create new forms of life, extend it, preserve it, clone it, evolve it, M shouted. Stop! Stop it! This is nonsense. This isn't real. You don't believe this, do you? And what does this have to do with Heather? Black-eyed Susan is dead. I thought it was nonsense too. Of course I didn't believe he was doing these things, but I believed that he believed he was. I thought about telling someone right after the confession. But the next day I see on the news he turned himself in. Then he died, so it was over. Even when Heather went missing, I didn't think anything of it. He was gone, but the thing is, people kept going missing after her. In other towns and other counties, it didn't stop. He told me it wouldn't stop, but I had no reason to believe him once he got caught. Certainly not once he died, but he told me he had so much more work to do. He told me he found the secret. He said he would make us all see. And Emily, I see. Dad, only a little bit. I know there's so much more, but I can see it now. It's in the air. It's in the trees. I've seen things that I don't think are real, but maybe they're more real than any of us, and it's growing. It's here. I saw Heather. I saw her walking outside in the night in the fog. I saw. Em stood up. Okay? Okay, we have to go. I'm sorry, Dad. I'll come back. I'll be back tomorrow. We'll talk, I promise. I have to. She briskly walked out of the room and out the front door. I followed closely behind. As we left, I heard him muttering, "No. Go home tonight. Go home tonight, Emily." She sat in the driver's seat of the bug, hands clasped on the steering wheel, nearly hyperventilating. I sat next to her. I can't look at him like that. I don't want to see him like that. He doesn't even look like my dad anymore. He's delusional. It's all insane. It doesn't even make sense because he said the girls had to be pure or whatever, but Heather did drugs and had sex when she was Dom. That doesn't fit with their purity. But he didn't know that. He's making it up. He wants to scare me so I'll come back and change my ways, so he can turn me back into who I was. It's fake. Why else would he make up such horrible things? I don't understand. Em rambled on justification after justification, her mind desperate to make sense of it all, but her body in the midst of a panic attack. Breathe, Em. Please, just breathe. It's okay. He's old, and he's confused sometimes. He has all this old trauma, and it's manifesting in ways he doesn't understand. It sucks, I know, but it's going to be okay. He'll be okay. We'll get him the help he needs. I tried desperately to reassure her, even though I was scared and disturbed beyond comprehension. Em calmed her breathing as much as she could. I don't want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. I know, but I know you, Em. You're going to regret it if that's how you leave things. You'll regret it forever. Let's go to the village motel. Have one nice, chill night. We'll order Chinese from Summit. They're still there, I saw. And then in the morning, we'll come back over. We won't talk about any of it. Nothing that'll set him off. We'll just have a lunch or whatever. Keep it light. Talk about his old harmonicas and shit. Say goodbye properly, then we'll go. Em sat back for a minute and then finally answered, "Okay." There are two moments in my life that I wish I could change more than anything in the world. The first moment I would change was me not being there for Heather before she disappeared. The second moment I would change was the moment I convinced Em to stay in Willow Bay for another night. My job that night was to distract her, to make her laugh and forget the earlier madness. One of the perks of that job was distracting myself too. We went on a walk down the main street, reminiscing about the shit we saw I got into. We checked out some of the old shops and some of the new ones. It was difficult for her to lift her spirits with how dreary everything looked under the gray veil and misty haze of the clouds and fog. I tried my best, but I was feeling strange too. It felt eerie here. There was a looming dread, a sense of unease and decay. The people all looked normal enough, but sometimes I felt like there were eyes on me. I was used to that to an extent. Growing up here and looking like, well, me, invites some crude and judgmental glances. But this felt different somehow. The last time I felt like this was that night at the bog. I tried my best to shake it off. The more I looked at the people, the more I noticed things were off. People looked haggard and a bit confused. A man stood in the doorway to a store with his hand on the handle, but wouldn't open it. He just stared into the glass. Another man I saw walking up and down the same street 4 times. I saw a man just spitting, over and over in the same spot on the sidewalk. Another was whispering to himself, though I couldn't hear what. I noticed some similar behavior when we first got here, but I dismissed it. People act weird sometimes. It's common, but it's not this common. Something about this whole place was wrong. I could see it, and I think Em could too, despite how preoccupied her mind was. We turned in at the motel, familiarly laying on our backs on opposite ends of the bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. Do you think any of it was real? Any of what my dad said? Em asked. I think I believe that confession happened. It just seemed too detailed to be completely made up. I think you really did meet the guy. What about what he said? The experiments. Just hearing that word again made me shudder. Do you really want to talk about this? I can't stop thinking about it. I feel like I have to. I understood what she meant. It never left my mind either. I don't know, it does line up with how the victims were found, I guess. It's the most awful thing I've ever heard. Those girls, I can't even imagine. I know, but it's over now. It's long gone. But Dad said it's still going. Maybe it is. People are still going missing. Maybe there's a copycat or he had a partner. If Heather got taken by them, I know it's hard, but you have to let this go. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we ever could have done. Thinking like this, it's only going to hurt you. I'm sorry, Lai, I'm a wreck. Em laid there, not speaking for a while. I could hear her holding back tears. Promise me something, and asked softly. What? After we get back from this trip, no more 8 years apart. We have to make it work. I'll come see you, and you'll come see me, as much as possible. Yeah, I am. I promise. It should have always been that way. I hate that it all got away from us like this. All that time lost. So many things I wish I got to share with you. I regret so much. I hate it too, but we were growing up. We were creating lives for ourselves. I know, but you're my rock. You're my best friend. You always have been. I don't want a life without you in it, Em said, her voice full of a warmth and sincerity that I hadn't heard from anyone in so long. It was a good thing the lights were off, because I was beginning to cry. Em still knew how to get me. A part of me really didn't think she still cared all that much about us or our friendship. I think I tried not to care about it for a long time, so that I wouldn't be the only one caring. I couldn't find the words to say, so instead I just reached my hand out towards hers and softly held it. I think we both needed it. I fell asleep. Still deeply unsettled, but ready to put this all behind us tomorrow. I expected to wake up softly, the morning sun shining in through the blinds, but instead I awoke in the dark, being shaken by Em. Lee, wake up, Em said in a frantic whisper. What's happening? I croaked. It's Heather? Those words pierced my slumber and I shot awake. What? What do you mean?
I saw her. Heather's outside.
Look. Em dragged me out of bed and I stumbled to the window. She pulled open the blinds for me. I stared out into the dark blue haze of the motel parking lot. It was hard to make out much past the fog. It looked so much denser at night. I definitely couldn't see a person. I don't see anyone.
What? No.
She was right there. Em looked outside, then darted past me and opened the door. Em. Wait. I couldn't get the words out before she was gone. I rushed outside to follow her. She stood in the middle of the parking lot, looking around in all directions. I staggered towards her. My body was still half asleep. Em, just calm down. Come back inside. There's no way you saw. Thier, come on. Em pointed behind me and then sprinted past me. By the time I turned my body to where she was running, whatever it was that she saw was gone. She ran out past the motel and turned the corner. I woke my legs up and ran as fast as I could after her. Hither. I heard her shout, echoing in the distance. I turned the corner, but I couldn't see anything. The fog was too thick. Behind the motel was a small field that led to a sparse forest. I couldn't see anything in the field, so I sprinted into the forest. Em. I picked a direction and ran, shouting her name over and over. The fog only got thicker. I wanted to keep running. I would have run forever. But I didn't even know if I was going in the right direction. I stopped and listened for any sign of movement, any footsteps, but I heard nothing. Just the quiet wail of the wind and the rustling of the trees. It was like she just disappeared. I spent the next 2 hours lost in the fog, out in the woods behind this modal, screaming and crying, begging for Em to come back. She never did. I knew someone got her. In that moment, all of this black-eyed Susan nonsense became real. I didn't know how or to what extent, but he was back. He got Em. She was gone. I found my way back to the motel. My entire body was shaking. It felt like my guts were in a blender. I was in complete hysterics. I couldn't believe it. I refused. Em couldn't be gone. I just got her back. I made those promises. We were never going to be apart again. I couldn't protect either one of my best friends. My body wanted to shut down. I wanted to curl into a ball and die. But this wasn't over. If what the old man said was true, if what all the legends I heard through the years were true, he wouldn't have killed her. That's not what he does. If I can find her, I can save her. At least that's what I was hoping. So I had to be strong and I had to think. Only one place came to mind, the bog. She had to be there. It all added up. I didn't waste another second. I got in Em's car and I drove. If any of this was true, even one word of it, then I needed 3 things before I went into the bog. I couldn't go in there unarmed. I needed something to shoot. I needed something to cut. And I needed something to burn. Stores were closed, but I knew everything I needed would be at Mr. Noby's place. I had broken in there many times before as a kid. I knew how to do it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't take a single steady breath to save my life. My body was in a constant battle between adrenaline and exhaustion. The town was quiet, deathly quiet. I suppose it made sense. Only an idiot would be driving in the middle of the night in this kind of fog. I made it to Mr. Noby's, parking a little ways down the street to be safe. I quickly made my way around the back of the house. Em's window was on the upper floor overlooking the backyard, and the lock was busted. I doubted they got it fixed since we kept it a secret. It was easy enough to climb up, especially with all the adrenaline I was feeling. Sure enough, the window slid open and the screen popped out easily. I hoisted myself inside as carefully as possible. It wasn't Em's room anymore, now it was just a junk room. That made it a little harder to maneuver without making a sound, but I managed. First stop was the bathroom. I grabbed a can of aerosol deodorant. Fortunately, I already brought a lighter. Then I snuck down the stairs. The stairs were always awful. They creaked like hell. I remembered that if you stick to the far side as you walk down, they wouldn't creak as much. Em and I snuck out a lot. He had a hunting rifle above the mantel and a chainsaw in the garage. It was easy enough to grab the rifle and get the ammo sitting underneath it. The chainsaw took a bit of looking since the garage was pitch black, but I managed. All I had to do was go back inside and then escape through the front. But when I stepped through the door, Mr. Noby was standing right there in the living room blocking my way. All I could see was his silhouette and it petrified me. He didn't move. Mr. Noby, I'm sorry, but it's Em. He sees you. Mr. Noby spoke shakily. He sounded like he was sleepwalking. She's in danger. Please, I have to go. I responded, trying not to sound terrified. She'll be okay. He'll make her see. Then you'll see too. His eyes were closed. I could see that he was in no state to attack me or to do anything really. I cautiously walked past him. I didn't have time to deal with a crazy old man. I opened the front door and took a step outside, but then he said more. He made Heather see. I turned around. He was facing me. His eyes were still closed, but he was smiling now. She was special. She was so strong. He found great use for her. I wanted to break down, but I turned back and kept walking towards the car at a brisk pace. He continued to talk. They'll find use for you too. You're all his little flowers now. The whores, the heathens, the sinners, and the blasphemers can now be purified. We can all be purified. We will all be accepted into his kingdom. For Black-Eyed Susan, the wilted one is God, and he will be our salvation. I got in the car and sped off immediately. As I peeled off down the street, I saw figures standing in the windows of the neighboring houses, staring at me. A few stood on the sidewalks. The fog was so thick now. This was no longer the town I grew up in. Something dark and depraved had seeped in and poisoned it. It was unrecognizable. I had to get to M, and I had to get us both the hell out of here. Willow Bay was gone. The cracked pavement of the streets became dirt roads as I carried on in the vague direction of where I remembered the bog to be. I had to wipe tears away from my eyes while I drove. They constantly welled up. I looked over at my haul of weapons, looking so out of place on the seats of this cute little car. Heather's parents, after much pestering, let me use their chainsaw once or twice when we would go help out on their farm, and I stole my grandpa's hunting rifle many times. It had been a lot of years, but I felt just confident enough that I could at least fundamentally function them if I had to. But I still had no idea what was coming. As far as I knew, I would be wading into hell itself. I got to the old Light Buddy Ranch, now decayed and completely overgrown, like the earth was reclaiming it. Then I saw the wall of trees. The beginning of it, at least. I got the car as close as it would go before I would worry about it sinking, and then I gathered my equipment and stepped out. Strapped the rifle to my back, and haphazardly stuffed the chainsaw and other tools into a backpack I had sitting in the back seat, the blades sticking awkwardly out from the top. The fog was denser than any I'd ever seen. Beneath it, countless tall, slender spires all bunched together. It didn't take long for the old familiar smell of perfume and death to penetrate my nostrils. Similar to how the town smelled now, but so much stronger. The ground beneath my feet began to squelch instantly, like the bog had expanded. I had no idea where I was going. There was no way for me to know. I just went forward. I could barely even see the ground anymore. Just gray among black. A tree came into view. A tree with an old ribbon tied around it. Suddenly I was reminded of how scared I was last time, and that fear began to creep into me now. I was hoping to block it out with adrenaline and my single, mended dedication to finding my best friend, but it got in. I was terrified, 1,000,000 times more since I didn't have M with me. I began seeing shapes in the fog, just like last time, figures slipping in and out of view. Only the faintest shapes. The cross shapes. They reminded me of everyone I just saw staring at me in town. It gave me the same dread. I was more alone in this place than I had ever been before, but I did not feel alone. I felt watched. Wading through the vast sinking mud was hard enough without all this shit strapped to my back. Now it was truly nightmarish. I fell over many times. Nearby got stuck for good on multiple occasions. That sensation of hands grabbing me and pulling me down in the mud was consistent. It felt like dozens of hands now. I trudged through the unforgiving and deathly cold marsh for hours, lost all feeling in my toes. Finally, I found my way to some solid ground. I collapsed on it and allowed my body to begin producing breath at a normal rate again. My muscles ached and throbbed. I tried wiggling my toes, and after a few minutes I was able to. Eventually I looked up, expecting to see that giant hawthorn tree we saw last time, but it wasn't there. This was a different place. I don't know why, but I had a feeling I needed to find that tree again. But how? I did see the symbols, though. Those inverted triangles with the line through the bottom. Earth, and I suppose that made sense now. They were carved into so many more trees. All I could do was keep moving forward as consistently despite the constant disorientation of the fog. I tried my best. I walked in what I thought was a straight line. Only I began seeing things repeat. The same stump, the same tree, the same flowers. I went in a circle. The figures kept appearing in the distance. The crosses. It felt like they got closer every time I'd see them. Every time I saw them, it became clearer what they were, even though I knew already. I tried taking a different path, but it didn't yield better results. The scarecrows inched closer and closer, while never appearing to move. Then I stepped on something. I nearly rolled my ankle. Instinctively, I looked down, and it looked like a small die at first, but it was a bead. A letter bead from M's friendship bracelet. The letter A. Either from Lilla or Heather. I scanned the ground looking for more, and amidst the fog, I was able to see the faintest glimmer of white in the dark browns and greens and grays. I walked over and picked up an L. She must have been leaving these like breadcrumbs. I saw another in the same direction. Now I finally had a path. Another L, then a few meters away, an H. The flora got denser as I progressed, and the scarecrows crept closer, but but never close enough that I could see their faces. Every now and then I'd hear the distant sound of a twig snapping. I had to try really hard not to scream. I continued on and found a clearing. I didn't see any letters at first, but I looked up and there it was, the hawthorn tree. I finally made it back here the long way. My mind was cast back to the first time we reached the tree. Em said she saw something. She said something was wrong with it. I didn't really see it. I thought I might have, but I wasn't sure now though. There was nothing wrong with it. To me it was just a tree. I got close this time. I looked hard into the mess of leaves and branches, but nothing. All I could see was another letter drop near the base. I walked over and snatched up an E. Was that it? I wondered. Is the tree somehow the destination? I looked all around the roots, looking to see if maybe there was a hatch or something. A hidden entrance to some kind of underground, I don't even know what. But I saw nothing, so I went back to scanning the area. Sure enough, another letter passed the tree. Maybe the tree wasn't important after all. Maybe it was just a kind of landmark, I thought. I carried on and picked up an A. I felt like I was getting close. Wherever I was going, it couldn't be far from the hawthorn tree. As I moved forward, picking up another L, I noticed the fog dissipate in front of me to reveal an enormous natural wall of rock and vines. It stretched on for all I could see, and I couldn't see the top of it. Some kind of vast fault creating a massive cliffside. I scanned it over and over, hoping to figure out what I'm supposed to do now. No obvious entrance to anything, certainly no way to climb it, so I cast my eyes down once again, hoping the letters would guide me. A few meters away, I didn't see one letter as I expected. I saw all the remaining letters, dropped in a pile at the foot of the cliff. This was the end of the line. I didn't understand. There was nothing here. Just a cascade of earth and rock like the rest of the wall. But then I looked harder. Behind this one thicket of vines and roots, there was the tiniest gap between the rocks. This little area was camouflaged. I thought about using the chainsaw, but I didn't want to draw attention. Not just yet. I reached my hand in and pulled at the vines. They were very stubborn. I tore and I ripped, eventually making some headway, and I could see there was indeed an entrance to something behind here. Thin, impossible to find. I wouldn't have seen it in a million years if the beads weren't laid out right at the foot of it. That wasn't the only thing I found. As I pulled my hand back from the mess of vines, it was covered in blood. Rich, dark, crimson blood. The vines' blood as I ripped them. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I had no time to think about it. I had to get in there. As I stuck more of my body inside, forcing my way through the vines and squeezing between the rocks, I noticed that the rock on my right side could move. I pushed and it slid open with minimal resistance. Then I got my whole body inside. I couldn't believe it. I made it. I found something no one had been able to find in decades. I was here. I could find M. I instantly could tell what this place was, or at least what it used to be. I could see by the long cavernous hallways, the hanging overhead lights, and the wooden support beams. At some point in history, this was a mine. I pulled out the rifle and got it ready. I was in the mouth of hell now. This place was wrong. The fog wasn't inside, but the feeling of it was. A million invisible tiny particles floating by dancing off my skin, being breathed in through my nostrils. My heart rate was already elevated, but now I could feel it all through my body. I could hear it deep in my brain. Thudding, pulsating, low droning booms making my temples flex, reverberating throughout every inch of me. My vision got narrower as I walked inside. The edges turned to static and bright flashing storms of color that weren't really there. It felt like a migraine. Was it the cocktail of adrenaline, anxiety, and physical exertion causing my body to shut down, or was it this place? The long hallway broke off into many rooms, each one crudely labeled and smudged and faded Sharpie on basic paper stickers now yellowed and decayed. Some labels overwritten multiple times. I knew I had to check all of these rooms, as much as I didn't want to know what lay inside. The first doorway on the left read admissions. I led with the gun and walked inside. Just a few empty cots. There was a clipboard on the wall with a list of names, ages, and eye color. I didn't want to look at it too closely, but the most recent name was Emily Noby. I rushed out and moved to the room on the right. Garden. This room was unusually sanitary and sterile, akin to a makeshift college science lab. full of multiple glass cases with soil and various plants and little water spritzers above them. I didn't want to take too much time, but I had to look a little closer. Some of the plants inside looked strange. They looked squishy, veiny, some had little tufts of hair. Most of the plants in the soil weren't actually plants, just little wet mounds of mulch and blood. Some had more than that. Some looked more fleshy. I think there might have been a tooth in one of them. I wanted to retch. I couldn't fathom what those were. I didn't want to know. I moved on. The next room on the left read, Genusium. I didn't know what that word meant. Inside looked like another thrown together lab. There were test tubes and beakers and more specimens behind glass. These specimens looked bizarre, like oversized seed pods, but they were bleeding, seeping red like the vines. My mind couldn't comprehend it. I was feeling queasy and light-headed as I made my way to the next room. It read, Graft Chimera. I entered and almost screamed. There were people here. 2 people, strapped down to cold metal tables. I saw them breathing. As I stepped forward, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. The first person had tree branches growing and protruding out of the side of their neck, puncturing through the skin. I could see them choking, but they wouldn't die. There was even a small branch coming out of their mouth. The second person on the table had the same thing, but the branches were coming out of each of the stumps where their hands and feet should be. Surgically grafted, just like Mr. Nobi said. They looked at me. The fear and pain in their eyes was beyond comprehension. They didn't have to say a word. I knew they wanted me to kill them. I'm sorry, I sobbed. I'm so sorry. I stumbled out of the room, tears completely obscuring my vision. I couldn't do it. I couldn't. All I could do was cry and suppress the urge to scream and vomit. I really didn't want to keep going. My legs were made of lead. It took every ounce of willpower to move them forward. A sense of ultimate dread filling my entire being as I neared the next room. I wiped the tears from my eyes and read the words on the label. I wish I hadn't. I didn't think it could get worse, but it just did. I tried to unknow the words. I begged myself, I begged the universe, I begged gods I didn't even believe in for the chance to know those words. But there they were. Maternity ward. I glanced inside. It was everything I was afraid of and so much worse. The sound that escaped my mouth was not of my own volition. A row of cots, most of them full. Oxygen masks on their faces. Various tubes hooked up to various places on their bodies. Their bellies, I couldn't see their eyes. Thank God I couldn't see their eyes. None of them moved. They must have heard me, but none of them acknowledged me. They were frail, ghastly. Their arms were practically bones. They didn't even look remotely alive, but they were breathing. All of their skin was pale and gray, with squiggled red, blue, and green veins all over those piles of fleshy mulch I saw. Was that the product of this? I collapsed to my knees and frantically covered my mouth because I had to scream. Over and over. One final impulse ripped through my head. One final command that cut through all the horror I was facing. Get out. Get out. I leapt to my feet and stormed onwards. Only a few rooms left. I didn't look at the labels, and I blocked out the contents inside. I was reduced to base instinct alone. I took in no information other than, is he in here? All I know is I saw bodies and I saw flowers, and I didn't see M. I passed 2 more rooms, but as I looked into the third, my tunnel vision broke. I saw her. I found her. She was laying on another of those cold metal tables. Our eyes met. She looked so tired. Lilla. She uttered weakly. I almost walked right in before I noticed the 2 men standing over her. One I knew instantly. Dumb. So much anger surged through me, so much hate, so much pain, but not enough to take away from the shock of the other face. I've seen his face before. I've seen it numerous times in news articles all my life. Was it actually him? It couldn't possibly be, but here he was. I was staring into the eyes of Darren Barbeau. A look of shock covered their faces, but after a moment Darren smiled. My little flower, he muttered in a deeply inhuman and hollow voice. I couldn't let the shock get the better of me. I couldn't freeze. I couldn't allow myself to break. My final impulse took over once again. I raised the rifle, pointed it at his head, and shot. His head tore apart like confetti, exploding into a firework of gore. A sea of crimson with streaks of yellowy-green phlegm painted the wall behind him. His body collapsed to the ground. Dumb lunged towards me, and I shot again, getting him in the throat. He went down instantly, gurgling and choking on his own blood. He tried to speak, but couldn't. Good. I had no desire to hear what he had to say. Why and how he became a part of this, for how long, what he did to Heather and why he chose her. I decided his death was more important than those answers, so they would die writhing in pain alongside him. I grabbed Em. Her body was weak and she wasn't able to put any weight behind her movements, so I swung her arm around my neck and pulled her to her feet. I walked her briskly out of the room, but when I turned to head back down the long hallway, I was face to face with the scarecrows. Almost a dozen of them blocking my path. Their arms weren't outstretched anymore, and I could clearly see their faces now. Flesh patched into burlap, formed into a misshapen sack of a head. Some had parts of actual faces. Others just had generic smiley faces stitched on. Some were more sophisticated looking than others. Some almost looked completely human. I looked to the adjacent room. It read, Black-Eyed Susan. Rael didn't want to know what was in there, but we had no choice. I moved Em and myself inside, walking us backwards. I looked to the doorway, letting go of Em and raising the rifle towards it, waiting for them to approach. But they didn't. I don't think they were aware enough to attack. They just moved and watched and waited. I almost felt relief when they didn't approach. Until Em screamed the most horrific scream I'd ever heard. I turned around and saw her looking behind us into the room. I didn't want to look, but I did. Rows of chairs on opposite sides of the room, all filled. More people unmoving, with tubes running in and out of their bodies, except these ones were very different. There were so many more tubes, all pumping in liquids of various colors and consistencies. It also didn't take long to realize these people were not human. Not all the way. Their flesh was patchy and incomplete, and they also had some kind of film all over it, almost like a translucent cobweb or something. Their faces were wrong in every conceivable way. These were the scarecrows. This is where they grow. This is where they MBB. They look more advanced than some of the ones I glanced at in the hallway. They're getting better, they're getting closer to the real thing. They just have trouble with the faces. I had a feeling these were the products of the maternity ward, the ones that worked. These were his hybrids. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what all the tubes led to. At the back of the room, it all fed into one more body. I hesitate to refer to it as a body. Sure, it had arms and legs and a torso, a feminine form, but the head. Maybe at one point it was a human head, but whatever had been done to it made it impossible to see as such. I couldn't help but move closer to try and discern what I was looking at. I knew this was Black-Eyed Susan. Not the man, not Darren Barbeau. This was what it was all for. This was the catalyst. This was what made all his delusion into reality. Its head, from a distance, looked like the head of an actual black-eyed Susan flower or a sunflower. Colorful petals all spread out in every direction from the black center. Looking closer, the petals were skin. The face was carved into pie slices, peeled back, and hung on wires to mimic the petals. Beneath the petals, the place where you'd find the sunflower seed's eyes. Dozens of human eyes. Every eye from every victim. And I could see the pupils dilating as I got closer. Everything that Darren Barbeau, from the eyes of his victims, the secret of life, now rests inside her. And it's being pumped into all these people, and God knows what else. No, no, no. Oh God, can't be, and began to cry uncontrollably. I thought it was just because of the horrific sight before her, but it was worse than that. So much worse. It took me a minute to notice what she noticed. I almost wish I didn't. On her left wrist, a friendship bracelet. I fell numb. This was too much to process. Too far beyond my comprehension. Em collapsed, crying and screaming until her voice went hoarse. I wept silently and unmoving. I didn't have any more breakdowns left in me. I was broken. My heart, my spirit, my will, all of it gone to dust in an instant. I put the rifle down and took off my backpack, setting it on the ground and pulling out the chainsaw. It took 2 pulls of the cord for it to turn on. It was loud, but I didn't hear anything now. I just stared. Stared into the dozens of eyes, and they all stared back at me. I love you, Heather. I raised the saw above my head, then plunged it into the mess of eyes. They popped and squirted and shredded like plump grapes, purring and spraying and oozing all over the room, liquids of every color. I couldn't stop. I carved and I carved. I severed every cord. I turned the head to mush. I couldn't let a single eye remain. The eyes that fell to the ground intact, I squished under my shoe. The rotting perfume scent intensified and overwhelmed my senses. I could see it in the air escaping from the holes I carved. It looked like glitter. The color storm on the edges of my vision crept in and enveloped me. The dark cavernous walls began to pulsate with vivid scarlet and cerulean hues. My focus pushed and pulled. Every motion created a colorful haze in its wake. The room spun and my legs fell out from under me. I turned my body and reached for M, but she looked a mile away. I looked up and the ceiling melted away into a void more vast than anything I had ever experienced. The glitter floated into the void and shimmered like stars. The colors wove in and out of those stars. Beautiful deep blues, vibrant purples, and cosmic greens lit up the void. So impossibly big, and I felt so impossibly small. All sound cut out. Only the slow, thumping heartbeat in my ears remained. The universe was showing itself to me, and it was beautiful and horrible. I led there gazing for what felt like a lifetime, into the endless cascade. I felt trapped in my own body. All I wanted to do was reach out and join the stars, but a shape formed in front of me, blocking my view. I heard external sounds and felt vague, fuzzy sensations across my face. I didn't want to leave this place, but it all came into focus. The shape became a face and I recognized it. The sounds became words and I recognized them. "Lila, we have to go now," M's voice said, sounding 100 feet away. I remembered by purpose. My eyes focused on her face and I came back to Earth. The ceiling returned, but the colors didn't stop. The first thing I saw after M's horrified face were the people sitting in the chairs. They weren't sitting motionless anymore. They were shaking violently, uncontrollably. M tried to pull me up, but she was still weak. I made it to a knee. I heard a pop, and I turned my gaze towards it. One of the shaking people now had a bright, oozing hole in their shoulder. Another pop, and I saw something on their body quickly pustulate and burst a 6-inch hole into their abdomen. I heard more cracking and popping behind me, along with violent, inhuman screams. 2 more pops. One on the kneecap and the entire leg burst off. One on the face, taking half of the head with it. Vines and tendrils began creeping out of the holes, wiggling and writhing. Another body caught my attention. Its eyes began to bulge unnaturally. Pushing violently out of its skull, it screamed. Then hard, barbed tree branches shoved the eyes all the way out and hooked downwards. 2 more branches came out of the ears, and a final one emerged from the mouth. It looked like a barbed, wooden hand. The tree-like hand then clenched around the face it had emerged from and began pulling it inward. Like sticking your hand through a sweater sleeve and pulling it inside out. What happened to the body as this occurred, I can't begin to describe, but I vomited. Sharp green needles protruded from another one's mouth, pushing out and replacing its teeth. Its lips ripped open to create a mouth 3 times as wide. The top half of the head snapped back 90 degrees. A geyser of red and milky green followed. Vines and branches ripped through another's abdomen so sharply and violently that the entire bottom half of their body was severed. Another had spider-like branches protrude from the sides of their rib cage underneath their arms, then clasp around their torso and rip it open like a Christmas present. I could only guess that without Black-Eyed Susan, the hybridization became unstable and was violently rejected. They were all being viciously torn to shreds by the atrocity of their own biology, and yet through it all they refused to die. Bones cracked and popped, flesh tore and burst, a chaotic mess of serpentine protrusions flailed in every direction. The room spun. The deep scarlet haze, the pulsating walls in rhythm with my throbbing temples, the cacophony of pain, inhuman screams. I could imagine hell looking any other way. M pushed me to leave, but I had to do something. I couldn't leave it like this. They needed to die, and this place needed to die. I gave M the saw, and I reached into my bag for the spray can and the lighter. If anything can kill them, it would be fire. I didn't waste another second. They all lit up easy. Their grotesque, mutilated bodies shook and screamed in the wall of orange flame. The writhing severed pieces inched towards me in whatever way they could, but they went up too. M and I ran to the door. The scarecrows in the hallway began to jitter and ooze fluid. I sought to put an end to all of them when I was grabbed and tackled by the headless body of Darren Barbu. Of course he lived. Of course he wasn't human either. He held me down and clawed at my face. The hole in his neck began to bubble and expand. I could see something being savagely forced through it, birthed from it, violently and painfully. As it squeezed its way through, I could see it was another head, a primitive, undercooked attempt at a head. No skin, no lips, no eyes, no eyelids, just muscle tissue over wooden skull, with branches and barbs protruding from almost every inch. It stuck its fingers in my mouth and pulled at my jaw. I tried to bite down, but the force was too strong, and I felt a pop as it began to dislodge. I didn't feel pain so much as intense discomfort and panic as a part of my body wasn't where it was supposed to be. I looked into the cavernous black eye holes on the messy, bleeding skull. It tried to speak, but before it could figure out how to articulate words, the chainsaw came ramming through it, then shot upwards, cutting it up the middle, leaving both halves splayed apart. The various multicolored liquids drenched my face. I shoved him off of me and spat his fingers out of my mouth, while his body spasmed and flailed like the others. One of the scarecrows grabbed M as I was getting back to my feet. This wasn't just any scarecrow, though. It looked closer to human than any of the others, and the clothes, the long mess of bright orange hair. This scarecrow was made to look like Heather. And it did. It looked so much like her, except for the face, which was just another burlap smiley face stitched on. My heart couldn't break any more. I was livid. This mockery of our best friend. The desecration. The way it tricked us into all of this entire trip. I couldn't stand it. I pushed it back and lit it up. It stumbled backwards into the others, and they collapsed in an inferno. They didn't have the basic survival instincts to run away from the flames, they just burned. Barbeau stirred. His hand began to reach out, but he too was caught in the blaze. We only had a few seconds to move past them before the entire hallway was lit up. I pushed M forward, and then I had to make a leap. My pant leg was singed, but I made it. Maybe all the caked-on mud helped. We stumbled quickly towards the exit, trying to outrun the smoke and flames, but I stopped at the maternity ward. I wanted so badly to be able to do something, but they were so far beyond my or anyone's help. They were corpses. All I could hope for was that the smoke would get through the oxygen masks and take them quickly before the fire did, and their suffering would end. It pulled me away, and we continued on. The flames spread slowly across the vines and leaves that were strewn along the ceiling and walls. The smoke spread so much faster. Our pace quickened as our lungs constricted. I expected to hear more screams as the fire spread, but I didn't. We ran through the vines at the end of the tunnel and fell out onto the grass. Immediately we could breathe again. Still cuffing, almost passing out, but we made it. We were free. The nightmare that had plagued us for decades was at an end. Em and I slowly caught our breath and rose back to our feet. I looked at her and she looked at me. Then she lunged towards me, wrapping her arms around me tight. I just got my breath back. But it was taken out again. This time I was okay with it. She sobbed into my chest. I could feel her tears soaking into my shirt. I wrapped my arms around her too. I couldn't think of anything to say, and I don't think she could either. We slowly made our way back. I saw the hawthorn tree in the near distance. Sunlight began to beam over the horizon, and the fog appeared to be thinning. The pain in my jaw began to rear its head, but I managed to kind of pop it back into place temporarily. It hurt a lot. The horrors of this night seemed to be over, except as we got closer to the hawthorn tree, something didn't look right. We both saw it as we got closer. Something was wrong. Something was so wrong. Em recognized it from last time. The tree looked wet, but it hadn't rained. Then the tree started warping, moving, pulsating. It wasn't just my vision distorting this time. As we got closer, the wetness became more clear. It was blood. The tree was bleeding, and it was breathing. The blood soaked into the ground beneath it, softening it. Now even the ground began to breathe, and we began to sink. I felt hands pulling me down once again, except now I could see them. There really were hands. They were everywhere. Hands, and other pieces of bodies. Not solid, but solid enough. The disposed remnants of failed experiments. Liquefying in their own endlessly pumping blood, still alive. There was no bog. They were the bog. Em managed to find a stable piece of ground, but my legs were caught. I was going down, it was past my shins. The bark of the tree looked moist and fleshy, and it began to open. A big 7-foot-tall vertical slit formed in the center of the tree. The sides curled outwards, and beneath it was a wall of bleeding flesh. Beneath that wall, a hand pressed against it, then another hand, then another. I saw what this was. I saw it inside the mine. This was the gynoecium. If the maternity ward produced those scarecrows, what did this produce? I sank up to my thighs now. The hands reached and tugged at my arms and torso. Im tried, but she couldn't get to me. One of the hands within the tree pushed through. Steam rose into the sky, and a body began to climb out. The body was hairless, shiny, and coated in some king of translucent slime. But the face was unmistakable, Darren Barbeau. As his torso rose over the threshold, it didn't give way to a bottom half. The flesh continued into a big mound. More arms and legs sprouted from the mound, a dozen or more. More heads, more bodies, all molted together. A big tangled spider web of parts, but even the parts weren't right. I saw a mouth on one of the feet. I saw an ear in the middle of a torso. I saw eyes coming out of a shoulder. Everything was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Killing black-eyed Susan sent everything into madness. I was unable to look away from the grotesque sight before me, but then I heard the chainsaw. Em started it and was carving through the mud around me, shredding hands and tendrils to pieces. I saw teeth and parts of bones flying all over. The sinking eased up and I was able to climb a few inches. The mess of limbs, bodies, and heads stumbled out of the curtains of bleeding flesh without end. With every movement it made, it revealed more. Im screamed. Not a scream of terror this time, but a scream of rage and desperation. She ran towards it with the chainsaw in hand. I continued to slowly pull myself out of the mire. All I could see were pieces flying, and the now familiar sight of waves of red and spurts of pale green ooze spraying and popping and exploding. It rained upon me. Every single mouth on the abomination was screaming, but Em didn't stop. I managed to pull myself completely out, and I ran over to Em. I grabbed her from behind and pulled her back, then turned to face the creature myself, or what was left of it. Now just a quivering pile of bloody pieces. A mouth in the middle of a stomach began to open, looking like it was trying to speak. I flicked a lighter and sprayed a ball of fire into it. The pile lit up and screamed. Then I sprayed all around the tree. It took time. It pulsated and oozed more and more blood, but it went up. I saw the hands in the mud violently shake and fall apart. We staggered back and watched as it burned. Both of us were coated head to toe in all sorts of prudent mess. Smoke filled the sky, but the fog faded and the sun was fully shining. It was finally over. I reached for her hand and she held it once more. We waded through the forest and the marsh, no longer feeling the pull of the liquid flesh, and came out on the other side alive. We found Em's car right where I parked it and we left. There wasn't a lot of conversation as we made our way back into town. We were both just too tired. Our sanity had been stretched beyond its limit, and we had no idea how to process it. We stopped at the motel and I had the best shower of my life. We got changed, trashed our old clothes, and hit the road. I thought about staying at the motel, resting a while. But we needed to get out of this place. Em decided to go see her father again before she left. I was very hesitant, but he seemed to be doing better. Everyone did. The fog was gone. He didn't appear to recall anything of our interaction last night, nor did he care to bring up anything else from the day before. They parted ways amicably. Aim kept it together well. We left the town, a massive weight lifted from my chest. We were on our way home. Eventually, Em broke the long, incredulous silence. "I'm sorry, Lee. I'm so sorry I dragged you into all this." "No," I interrupted, but Em continued on. "It was so selfish after all these years to make you come up here, to bring you into all my she problems. I almost got you killed. Or worse. I don't even know. You couldn't have known. How the hell would you have ever known? It wasn't on you. Don't do that. I can't stop thinking about it. It's all that's in my head." I could hear Em about to break down. I wasn't far off either. "I know. I can't either. Let's just not talk about it right now, okay? We only have a few hours left together and you're right. I don't want this to be how we end things." "Yet," I responded. Solemnly, I realized I really didn't want this to end. Lee, Em asked. "Yeah. Can we do your playlist? I just feel like mine is a bit much right now." I laughed for the first time since this all started. Things weren't back to normal. I don't think they would ever be, but we could be okay, just for right now. She continued, and before we stopped talking about if just thank you for saving me. It was a long trip back, but it didn't feel long. All the things weighing on our minds made time pass quickly, even though we tried not to think about it. There was no shut eye. We didn't even bother trying. Before I knew it, Im pulled up to my building. We both got out. I gathered my bags, and we stood on the sidewalk. Neither of us felt ready to leave the other, especially me. So, I persuaded her to come up to my apartment and have a coffee for the road. I knew my place looked like shit, but I also knew Em never cared about all that. She spent lots of time in my shitty place as a kid. More importantly, after everything we went through, who cares? It was difficult to care about anything anymore. I made her the coffee. There was still so much to say, but I didn't know how to say it. How long am I allowed to park out front there? Em asked.
Oh, you're not. What? Shoot.
Lila, I'm sorry. I didn't think about that. You're probably fine, though. If you hurry, you'll be fine. Good Lord. Okay, I guess I should go. A silence hung in the air for a moment. Yeah, you probably should. I responded. I really didn't want her to go. I didn't want to be alone. And I didn't want to be without her. Okay, you come over or something soon, right? Aim asked, hopefully. I will. We'll make it work? Good. Em started making her way towards the door. Thank you for everything. I'm gonna miss you. Yeah, I'm gonna miss you too. Get home safe and everything, Em. I uttered, awkwardly. Trying not to let the sadness or desperation show. Em smiled a half smile and opened the door. The word escaped from my mouth, but I cut myself off before finishing the sentence. Em let go of the door and turned back to me. I don't want you to go, I muttered. She looked at me silently, expecting to hear more. So I had to say more, even if I couldn't form the thoughts correctly. Even if I might say too much. I need to say I never told you there's so many things. And so many times I wanted to, but I was afraid of things changing. Like I was afraid you wouldn't. I was stammering and stumbling. I couldn't believe after all this, I still couldn't just come out and say it. I just don't want to be apart. I don't want to be alone, especially after all this shit. And I can't let you go without telling you, because I almost lost you and I just can't. Em closed the distance between us, and without saying a word, she leaned in and kissed me. I didn't think my heart could take any more surprises, but this last one I welcomed. Pain shot through my dislocated jaw, and I couldn't have cared less. When she pulled away, she had tears in her eyes. I could feel them on my face. She must have seen how flustered I was because she laughed a little through the still flowing tears and caressed my cheek. Mem too. So the trip didn't end. I decided to get back in her car and we drove all the way to her place. I ended up staying for 2 weeks. What happened during those 2 weeks is ours to keep, and ours alone. We talked to Em's dad over the phone. Didn't tell him about any of that, but he did tell us some things. The odd behavior in Willow Bay and some other surrounding areas did not go unnoticed. Tests were done and there was determined to be what they called some sort of bioweapon unleashed. And caroselized hallucinogenic drug, as they called it, making everyone who breathed in enough of it prone to suggestion and vivid hallucinations. I went back and forth about that. Certainly, that's what happened to the town. That's what hid in the fog. I figured that much already. How far did that drug go? I would love to believe that everything I experienced that night was merely the product of excessive hypnotic drugs. The worst trip of all time. Then the earth I live in would make a lot more sense. I knew the bog was real. I knew the mine was real. I even knew the experiments were real. But the monsters, the scarecrows, the flesh, it would make sense if they weren't real. I was expecting to see them, so I saw them. Classic hypnosis. But every time I take a bite of food and my jaw clicks, I can't help but doubt. It would be too easy. I'm with Em again now. It's been 4 more weeks, and I just moved the last of my stuff in. We're doing well. We have nightmares almost every night, and crying fits every few days, but having each other to hold on to makes it all bearable. So that's the story of Black-Eyed Susan, of Darren Barbeau, of the untold and unthinkable horrors lurking in the dark, beyond the edge of perception, comprehension, and sanity. Mine's just one tale of one little corner of the world. You might not know it, but your corner might have a monster in it too. Stay safe, everyone. Tell the people you love that you love them. I have to get back to Em now. We were planning a trip to somewhere cold. We might not end up going, though. She's been very nauseous these past few days. So we'll see.